Hello and welcome to the fourth Seed Conference event, Seed for Growth. My name is Douglas Martin, and my presentation today is a continuation of my talk from Seed 3, The Origins of Secret Societies. This is part 2, The Cult of Osiris and the Mingling of the Mythology with the Perfected Eschatology. This is my title slide from part 1, The Origins of Secret Societies, a general chronicle regarding the rise and influences of occult organizations. So when we're talking about secret societies, we're dealing with a hidden history. In order to understand the hidden history, we first must understand our classical history. We have to have a long view of history. So this idea that history is fake or history is written by the victors, it's a cop-out, quite frankly, because we can never understand our hidden history until we understand our classical history. We have to work with what we have. I left off in part 1 talking about the craft guilds and the end of the Dark Age. So what is a Dark Age? Well, in the first place, it represents the end of learning. So with the fall of the Roman Empire meant the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. And Rome's ambition was to unite Northern and Western Europe under the single banner of Latin Christendom. Following, roughly the 5th century, we enter into this dark period. So the Dark Age implies an anti-intellectualism, or this Latin Christendom is an anti-intellectualism, which I found to be quite alarming. A Dark Age also implies very limited chronicling. There's very few chroniclers in the Dark Age. And there is much ambiguity in the history that we have. Thirdly, a Dark Age implies a degenerate age of ignorance and barbarism, a barbaric time. So, out of the Dark Age, or through the Dark Age, resulted in feudalism in Europe. So feudalism is not really a de facto or a planned system, typically. Typically, a feudalism is the result or a de facto result of a failed central authority. In this case, that's Rome. We're talking about Rome and this Holy Roman Empire. And this failed central authority further led to what we can call manorialism, which was the complete collapse of the trade routes. And at that point, everything that was needed by the manor had to be produced on the manor, by the manor, for the manor. So it's a sort of a condensed feudalism. And we have to understand what gave rise to feudalism basically was advancements in agricultural implementation. And improvements in tool making allowed them to till and plant in the hard caliche in Northern Europe, whereas they previously were unable, and that led to an accumulation of wealth of the landholders or the aristocracy, which resulted in many of them defecting from the authority of the central authority of Rome, and ultimately condensed further down into manorialism. So the end of the Dark Age is the end of the manorialism and the feudalism, which means it's a return of the trade routes. So we're talking roughly, the end of the 10th or the beginning of the 11th century constitutes roughly the end of the Dark Age. Also, I want to talk about the Council of Nicaea. See, following the Council of Nicaea, everything non-Christian, with the exception of Judaism, was deemed pagan. And that was meant as a pejorative, which is basically an insult. It basically meant country dweller or rural folk, implying less educated or less civilized, beyond the pale of civilization, barbaric. Now, through the Dark Ages and following the Dark Ages, we saw the phenomenon of this cathedral building. And these cathedral builders and these stone masons and these Roman architects, these Comacene masters, became the unwitting caretakers of the ancient wisdom, because ancient knowledge had been stored in the implementation and the tool making, and in the architecture in the forms of spires, pillars, columns, archways. And in the ancient world, everything had been spiritualized. The term animism typically refers to the spiritualization of physical things. And I want you to pay particular attention to Western architecture, especially just average mundane architecture in the West. You'll notice that everything has right angles and squared corners. Understand that's very important, because if you contrast that to the Eastern architecture where you have rounded structures, well, in the West, it's corresponding to the left brain intellectualism. And in the East, which is a masculine principle, but in the East, it's rounded, which corresponds to the feminine lunar principle. So keep that in mind. Church buildings embodied the functions of cathedral. Church buildings embodying the functions of a cathedral first appeared in Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa in the 4th century. But cathedrals did not become universal within the Western Catholic Church until the 12th century, by which time they had developed architectural forms, institutional structures, and legal identities distinct from parish churches, monastic churches, and episcopal churches or residences. So I have a lot of points that I'll be making. I'm going to have to take my time with some of this, but we've got a lot of material to cover, so we're going to be moving rather fast, and some of the material is advanced in a sense, but that's not to discourage you. It's to encourage you and understand that I'm trying to give you the gift in this presentation that will keep on giving. So the more knowledge we bring to it, the more we can glean from it. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, under the Council of Nicaea 325 AD, Constantine, the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, has called the bishops. As a statesman, he opts for an orthodoxy, and with the support of a powerful hierarchy, what he declares will define the Christian faith until today. The Gnostic Gospels burned. Christians killed fellow Christians by the countless thousands. Gnostics and everything pagan was wiped out. See, following the Council of Nicaea, heresy hunting became the new sport. The Serapeum, Alexandria's temple of Osiris, and its great library go up in flames. And what replaced the system of learning and knowledge was blind faith, which eventually led to the monks and aesthetic dryness of the establishment that imposed their doctrines and dogma on the population. Robert Bauval. The first old Christian monks in Europe would and did take great care that all writings or traces of writings of the cults and the old cults were destroyed, or at least all that they could not make use of and carry on in the new cult. Moreover, the old Christian monks were about the only men who could write at the time. It was a dark and ignorant age. For hundreds of years, the people depended upon what the priests told them, and these were not much better informed as to the truth than the poor, ignorant classes. But for all the brothers who did take an interest in the origin and real meaning of the rites and ceremonies of our order, referring specifically to secret societies, there in the ritual of Egypt, written in sign language, lies the true origin of all the mysteries in the world. And the study of the origin and evolution of the human race can be traced, the reasons for the foundation of the same. Sin and guilt gave rise to creed in which hell was imaginable, fear of God and admonishments of priests. It was not an idea that the Gnostics wished to share. And that gave rise to terms like Fideism, which basically represents a split between science and religion. Fideism is an epistemological theory which maintains that faith is independent of reason, or that reason and faith are hostile to each other, and faith is superior at arriving at particular truths. The word fideism comes from fides, the Latin word for faith, and literally means faithism. So up until the point where we have this fideism, reason was outright rejected. And then basically sometime probably, after the Dark Age, which basically represented the height of the papal power, we have this fideism coming in. So, the end of the learning of the Greek sciences and philosophies was restricted in the West, but now it's making its way back into the West, which gave rise to this term fideism. So this term fides or fid literally refers to faith or faithism. So we had these defenders of the faith, which is a dangerous proposition because they're willing to kill for their God. So now there's bigger game, you see. The defenders of the faith, simply fid def, was printed on all of the coinage. And the term infidel, which basically meant a heretic or a non-believer, we see the word fid there. And El references the term God. So infidel is basically no faith in God, or the absence of belief in God. Now, we're all familiar with the Crusades, mostly the Crusades into Jerusalem. And it's a big subject, and I talked about it a little in my second presentation. But like I said, we have to understand this long term of history. And a little known aspect of the Crusades is the Albigensian Crusade, which took place between 1209 and 1229 under Pope Innocent III. Basically, we had all of the craftspeople and artisans gathering in southwestern France, the Languedoc region of France, or in Provence. And these were people who were not accepting the orthodoxy or the authority of the church, and that included Jews and Christians. And Pope Innocent III ordered a crusade and basically annihilated these artisans and these craftspeople over a 20-year period. And it is part of history, but it's not a well-known part of history, and it needs to be better understood, because what really the Renaissance is about was overshadowed by the Protestant Reformation, which represented a split in the church. And another thing to keep in mind is during these craft guilds, the Jews were restricted strictly to the practice of money lending. And that plays out later on, as we'll see, how that is used in their own interests, in the interests of the Roman Church, because the Roman Church was demonized, for its greed. So ultimately, the church learned how to use the Jews to buffer its financial activities away from this central institution. When Pope Innocent III ordered this invasion into southwestern France, one of the Crusaders had asked him, how will we know who's Christian, or how we know who's not one of ours? And Innocent replied, kill them all and God will know his own. And we also had the Cathars, which were basically anti-authoritarian, or defiant of the authority of the Roman Church. And basically, is similar to a new Gnosticism, these Cathars. Also, the artisans, so what we're talking about is how hidden knowledge made its way into Western Europe and then ultimately emerged into the modern world. And this is what is underlying the forming of all secret societies, or even the idea of secret societies. So yeah, the idea of secrecy is repugnant. However, we have to understand that what created the necessity for the secrecy is even more repugnant, because we have this barbaric authority, and this Albigensian crusade represented some of the most atrocious events that have taken place in history. I mean, they burned people at the stake. They put them on racks. They built machines that were designed to torture people. And some of the other resistances to the central authority of Rome ultimately were assimilated by Rome. I'm talking about the Waldensians, which led to the Franciscans, and then the Dominicans. Those were assimilated by Rome, originally spawned as resistance to the church, assimilated by the church, became agents of the church. And then you had the Franciscans rooting out the heresies, and the Dominicans became the Inquisition, rounding them up. So what ultimately led to the Renaissance was this resistance to the church, and this desire to have a return of the learning of the Greek sciences and philosophies and Eastern traditions. And the real meaning behind the Renaissance, or what the Renaissance was really about, was obscured and overshadowed by this Protestant Reformation and this split in this Roman Church. And ideally, the split in the Roman Church basically amounted to just the church spreading its wings to the point where we now have roughly 30,000 sects or flavors of Christianity, but they all have one thing in common, and that is this historical Christ. So as long as everybody was willing to accept this historical Christ, they at this point could have Christianity in any flavor that they wanted it. So this Council of Trent in 1546 basically codified this Protestantism, and that led to thousands of sects of Christianity over time into the modern world. But they did have the ubiquity that they all supported the idea of the historical Jesus. Albert Churchward says, recently, ethics has been preached and written by men who have not the slightest idea of the harm they are doing to their fellow creatures and their country. They cannot have any real knowledge of the past history and evolution of the human race, or the causes of the rise and fall of all great nations of the past, or from whence originated the doctrines they believe in or profess to believe in. Many fallacies were still written and preached by some of our professors and great divines as truths, whereas the truth is entirely different. I therefore hope that my work may awaken and teach them before it is too late, and that the human race may not be sent back to the dark and degenerate age from which we have just emerged. Albert Churchward. So we're going to talk about this monotheism. And this is a difficult subject. And the late, great Gore Vidal called it the great unmentionable evil. And he states, the great unmentionable evil at the center of our culture is monotheism. From a barbaric Bronze Age text known as the Old Testament, three anti-human religions have evolved: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These are sky god religions. They are literally patriarchal. God is the omnipotent Father, hence the loathing of women for 2,000 years in those countries afflicted by the sky god and his earthly male delegates. The sky god is a jealous god, of course. He requires total obedience from everyone on earth, as he is in place not just for one tribe, but for all creation. Those who would reject him must be converted or killed for their own good. Ultimately, totalitarianism is the only sort of politics that can truly serve the sky god's purpose. Gore Vidal. So, in understanding monotheism, we must understand that while the Egyptians revered one great spirit, the spirit which they revered was not an anthropomorphized deity, much less a male deity, in any sense of a human-like deity, but rather as the sum total of all that is. So the idea of that which is divine is the idea of that which is perfect. And that could never be represented by a human form, because a human could never be perfect, much less represent something perfect in a symbolic form. So this corruption in this monotheism is the anthropomorphization or the personification of the, quote, God. The foundation of monotheism was laid when the various elemental powers were combined in a single deity to be worshipped as the one true eternal spirit. And that's Albert Churchward. Michael Mayer, in his work Silentium Post Clemores, 1617, he describes Rosicrucianism as having arisen from the Egyptians, the Brahmins, the mysteries of Eleusis and Samograce, and the Magi of Persia, Pythagoreans, and the Arabs. Its mystery schools, which acted as universities and monasteries, were the guardians of its wisdom. These schools experienced a distinctive flowering under the rule of Akhenaten, especially after he introduced the concept of monotheism. The Egyptian religion is particularly intriguing because of its mystery schools. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus had some of its origins in Egypt, in the god Thoth, together with the Greek god Hermes. This is around 1350 BC. This is the time of Akhenaten. And classical history basically picks up around, with Homer at 800 BC, but they build that on basically off of 1250 BC, and then between 1250 BC and roughly 900 BC, that's considered a dark age too. And I talked about that in my second presentation. This idea of monotheism bolsters the idea that the Egyptians were, prior to Akhenaten, polytheistic. If that's true, then that was a corruption of a more ancient doctrine. And first of all, what we think of gods are elemental powers, in fact, in the eyes of the Egyptians, and those became represented as personified or anthropomorphic forms. So this idea of personified gods is part of this corruption. So it could only be true in corrupted forms, this idea that the Egyptians were polytheistic. So what we think of as gods are in fact elemental powers in pure Egyptian forms. Now, Egyptologists have clumped together the pantheon of Egyptian deities and consider Osiris to be the first, when in fact Osiris is the last in line of the Egyptian deities. Now, this is a quote from Jesse L. Weston's Ritual to Romance, which I feel is the most important book of our time. Most of my work is based on this book, but this was the book that led me deeper into the anthropology and led me to fleshing out these other authors that we're going to be discussing today. Any religion with a fully anthropomorphized monotheistic deity is a ritual in an advanced form. So here we see these sky daddy gods, and in the lower right, this angel. We'll talk about that, but typically we're talking about a male monotheistic anthropomorphized sky god. So that's part of this confusion. That's part of the confusion, not understanding spirituality. Real spirituality is about freedom. It's not about what happens post-mortem. It's about what happens here and now. To the Egyptians, they had two tenets. And the first tenet was that ignorance is the only evil. Let's talk about that for a minute, And the second tenet was that what happens here matters. So this Latin Christendom wanted you to just set your sights on the afterlife and hope for a better life there, but forget about what's going on here. That's part of the issue that we're dealing with today. And the Egyptians fully felt that ignorance was the only evil and that what happens here matters. So, what is this ignorance that we're talking about? Well, it's not, ignorance of how to make a bundt cake or how to assemble a bicycle. We're talking about ignorance of the moral laws of creation, the natural laws that exist and are inherent in creation. They're part of the fabric of creation. So I'm thinking of the Thomas Jefferson quote, a nation that expects to remain ignorant and free in a civilized state expects what never was and never will be. And I'd like to actually augment that, okay? A nation that expects to remain ignorant of the moral laws of creation and free in a civilized state expects what never was and never will be. The ancient mystery schools welcomed faiths from every denomination and afforded its initiates the necessary tools for deeper insight into the doctrine or religious text chosen by the initiate. This was the general rule of all secret societies in the pre-Christian era. Modern religions, especially Judeo-Christianity or the Roman Church, endeavored since its beginning to eradicate and obliterate secret societies and their traditional role in the pre-Christian society. The secret society's primary function was to imbue temperament and moral judgment into the initiate by teaching the deeper inner mysteries, esoteric, of the chosen faith, exoteric, of the initiate, which was given as a pre-initiate prerequisite of being accepted into the mystery schools. So what that means is they weren't interested in bringing atheists into the mystery schools because they felt that the atheists were unteachable. This atheism, it's still a religious ideology, and their religion is the religion of the state and the religion of money, which is quite frankly what a corrupted religious institution amounts to. We're going to talk about Freemasonry. Freemasonry, for instance, welcomes all faith from every denomination. So what we're talking about here is that in the pre-Christian world, the secret societies were a vital function in society. So once you had completed your general education, you were expected to go out and choose a faith upon which you could be taken into and initiated into the mystery school. But first, you had to choose a faith. So, the only leap of faith that's required is that truth can be known. That's not a religion. The religion is the result of an Egyptian science that was not understood. So basically, at some point, the temples were basically stormed by the ignorant mobs, and the science was forced out into the light of day. And the ignorant mobs or masses never learned to handle the science, or never learned the science in the first place. And that's what gave rise to dogmatic religion. So we have to keep that in mind. And these are heady topics. Whether or not you think they're controversial, that's totally on you. But this is mature material, and it's not intended to offend anybody. It's intended to educate everybody. So this atheism, it's just another religion, whether an atheist realizes that or not. It is a belief system. This idea of democracy is mob rule, quite frankly, which means rule by the most ignorant. And that's not a political statement. It's just a simple fact that a democratic system means rule by the most ignorant. And if you want to talk about conservatism, most people don't understand the meaning of that term. That simply means orthodox. So I've talked about those terms in the past, and I'll continue to talk about them. That's not really what I'm here to talk about today, but just keep in mind that the idea of conservatism means orthodox. So you have an orthodoxy. It doesn't mean fiscally conservative. It means orthodox. So the idea of liberal is unorthodox or open to interpretation. For instance, in our country, in the United States, our conservatism is based on an orthodoxy of the Constitution. And then the idea of the liberalism is that the Constitution can be reinterpreted. And that's what leads to the revisionism. And these are both corrupted ideologies, okay? The right-left paradigm that we know as politics, that's completely a polarization, dialectical manipulation. So if we want freedom, the only way we're ever going to have that is to learn and understand these moral laws of creation, what we can call natural law, or the law of consequentialism. So let's move forward. But yeah, here that's actually the Grand Lodge in Philadelphia, and that's a personal photo. So that's the Egyptian room at the Grand Lodge in Philadelphia. I've been there twice, and it's just amazing. And I recommend that you visit it while it's still accessible. So coming out of the 12th century, we had this phenomenon in the early 13th century, and this rise of this cult of Mary, which was basically an appeal to the wrath of the king, and also ultimately resulted as an appeal to the wrath of God. So the feminine had been stripped from the Holy Trinity. And you had God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which represents an abolition of the feminine from the Christian doctrines, which I want to point out now, that's a solar doctrine. It's based on a masculine principle. And there's a lot more to that. We're going to talk about that. But we had this cult of Mary, which is an attempt to re-inject this feminine back into this patriarchal Christianity. And there's a lot of variables and a lot of factors that led to this. But ideally, it began as an appeal to the wrath of the king, and ultimately extended as an appeal to the wrath of God, and a return of the feminine to this Christian doctrine. So under Edward III, when he invaded Calais in France, or continental Europe, he had sentenced 6 of the burghers to be executed, and his wife made this appeal to spare their lives. And she appealed that he spared their lives, so he only executed 1 and spared the rest. And that had a profound effect on the rise of this cult of Mary. And this idea of this immaculate conception. Of course, the idea of the immaculate conception is older, but we're talking about the Virgin Mary and the feminine being reintroduced into a sterilized patriarchal doctrine, which we know as Christianity, or this Roman Church. When we point out now, there was a pure form of Christianity that far predates Rome. And that's known as Gnosticism in large, but it's even older than that. It goes back to the Coptic Egyptians. So Arthurian romances correlate to and are in relation to the cult of Mary, and particularly in the Vulgate and post-Vulgate romances. So the romances of the Arthurian legends are basically popularized, romanced, augmented variants of an ancient tradition or an older tradition. And they became romanced to the point where they were just forms of entertainment. But it has to do with this cult of Mary, because in the Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycle, we had the character Lancelot introduced into the Arthurian stories, and he ends up having a romance with Guinevere, or a love affair with Guinevere, and these are romanced versions of the Arthurian legend, which is a big subject. Not going to have time to fully open that up today, but I want you to understand how essential that is to understanding the Dark Age and getting into the anthropology. There's a lot to it, so if I start going too much on that, I'm going to get distracted from what we're here to talk about. And we're also going to talk about how the mystery of the Templars and the convention of the Holy Grail were used to transform the search for alchemical gold, or what we might term enlightenment, into a quest for a religious artifact that bolsters the Roman Church and the Christian faith. And why? So basically, Rome learned to assimilate culture, and this Holy Grail was a convention that was used to assimilate the Arthurian romance into Christianity. The fact that the Arthurian romance existed is one of the main reasons that this knowledge survived into the modern world. And this resistance of any form to the Roman Church is the only reason. The strong culture in Northern Europe, and particularly in Britain, which is different than continental Europe. So the history in continental Europe or the history in Britain is unique to the history in continental Europe. You have to keep that in mind, and that's partly because it's an island. But I don't know how many people are aware, but there's more surviving monolithic works and earthworks in Britain today than anywhere else in the world. So I would tell you that everything ultimately came from Egypt, but the way back all roads came from Egypt, but the way back to Egypt is through Britain, formerly known as Albion. And that's another big subject. I recommend Harold Bailey, and that's advanced material, but it's going to have to be dealt with. And that's Bayley, Harold Bailey. And he's one of the authors that I've been studying lately. We'll talk a little bit more about Harold Bailey. So following the Renaissance, we had this rise of these secret societies emerging in the West. And basically, we know that it seems to have started with this Rosicrucianism, which was kind of a union of pagan and Christian traditions, with this rose at the center of its tradition and this rosy cross. And we can see this rosy cross is adorned with pagan symbolism. We can think of Rosicrucianism essentially as the Western mystery schools. Even though this is, roughly 14th, 15th century, and even 16th century, more 15th and 16th century, we know that this tradition can be traced back as early as the 10th century, but that's, again, a big subject. We're not going to go fully into that. But there's a lot to say about this Rosicrucianism, and that it did give rise to what we know today as secret societies in the West, or emerging in the West. So, and then down here we see the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. That's basically a sect that came out of Rosicrucianism, and you can see it has the Rosy Cross. So as far as we know, the Rosicrucian was one of the many secret societies that had existed in Europe 200 or 300 years ago. The historian of the order, or rather the writer that is popularly considered to be such, is Mr. Hargrave Jennings, whose 2 volumes entitled The Rosicrucians, Their Rites and Mysteries contains a mass of bald, disjointed erudition, but throw very little light upon the subject. The value of this book is discounted by the statement in the introduction that the initiates of occult mysticism need to have no fear that the author will do otherwise than stand guard over their Kabbalah. Mr. A. E. Waite, the author of The Real History of the Rosicrucians, is a writer of a different caliber. He approaches his subject in a critical and skeptical mood and demolishes most of the generally accepted opinions. From the wreckage which he has left, I have gathered up a few unbroken fragments and have accepted these as being genuine and reliable. With the exception of the 2 manifestos, Fama Fraternitatis and Confessio Fraternitatis, and a few miscellaneous facts, I am inclined to think we possess no unquestionably authentic information about the origin of these Rosicrucians. Probably from time immemorial, secret societies have in one form or another existed among us. The Rosicrucians were not a political order, nor were they professedly alchemists. Alchemy is Neoplatonism. We'll talk about that. Although in an age when the belief in the possibility of the transmutation of metals was almost universal, there is very little doubt that many of the members, including Francis Bacon himself, acquiesced in the current philosophy. They were, however, preeminently a learned and beneficent order, whose avowed objects were the restoration of science and art and the alleviation of human misery. The mysterious secrecy which was assumed by the fraternity for purposes of shielding themselves from derision, insult, and persecution shrouded them with a romantic glamour and led to the circulation of absurd and extravagant reports as to their supernatural and unholy powers. This gave rise to the idea of devil worship and things like that. Anything that the Roman Church could do to stigmatize anything non-Christian. From time to time, charlatans and impostors, finding it a profitable card to play to claim connection with the powerful Rosicrucian Brotherhood, did so, and by their swindling of credulous people, caused these extravagant rumors to regain currency. Harold Bailey. So I don't know how many of us are familiar with this idea of Pan, but this is essentially a Greek nature god. And before I forget, I just want to go ahead and mention that Alban, Albn, is Pan, or the ban in Alban is Pan, or it's a reference to Pan. We're going to talk about Albany. And I'll go ahead and mention here, the ancient name for Britain is Albion. That's Albion. And that's a big subject. Trying not to go into that right now, but let's talk about Pan. So I'm stating here that this is the origin of our image, or our archetype of our modern day Christian devil. And we see here he has a pan flute. So this idea of Pan means also widespread. Like the idea of a pandemic is a reference to Pan. It's full range or full spectrum dominance, which is omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. So we have to understand full spectrum dominance if we want to understand how the world really works. And that's a big subject. It means you have to cover all of the bases. It means by the time that the ruling class is done, every molecule will have a barcode on it. Part of the legend of Pan was that if one was to wander astray and venture into the forest or the wilds away from civilization, then they were likely to encounter the deity known as Pan. This idea became a Christian convention in their Christendom doctrine in the allegorical sense of straying from the gospel and encountering the devil. Thus, anything not sanctified by the church was deemed of the devil. Our archetypal Christian devil is based on this likeness of Pan. So here we see from the A.E. Waite Tarot deck. I mean, I can talk about that symbol for a long time, but yeah, we have this archetype that became this archetypal Christian devil. I'll go ahead and say one thing to notice about this tarot card is that their chains are set lightly upon them, which means if they didn't want slavery, they wouldn't have slavery. And by slavery, I mean all forms of coercive government. So I don't want to try to break down that card right now. I'm just trying to make the point that this is where we get our idea for this archetypal Christian devil and how that was used to stigmatize everything non-Christian. So in the photo adjacent to that, we see this statue of this Baphomet, and this became a very powerful political device, and is still used vigorously today. So anytime they don't like, let's say, the policy or the politics, that, let's say they want to put the 10 Commandments at the State House, they just show up with this statue and say they want to put their statue there, and then they'll quickly withdraw their 10 Commandments to avoid having this Baphomet put on display in public view. It's really quite hilarious, but it's merely a laugh, but it's really a cry. So they would move this Baphomet to forward or alter public political policy. It's a powerful political device. This archetypal Christian devil has been used as a political convention to stigmatize anything non-Christian or anything that challenges their dogma. So we really have to, if we consider ourselves to be a true Christian, then we have to understand what real Satanism is, which is basically internal opposition, cognitive dissonance. The idea that money and government could ever be anything moral. Government in the sense of coercive government. Because that's violence and that can never be moral. So if we truly consider ourselves Christians, then we have to understand that these ideologies of statism, money, and government are immoral. And that's what we can define as true Satanism. But Satanism is an ambiguous term, and most people confuse it with devil worship. This idea of devil worship. So, what real Satanism been stigmatized by this idea of devil worship. Let's keep that in mind. Joseph Conrad says the belief in a supernatural source of evil is not necessary. The belief in a supernatural source of evil is not necessary. Men alone are quite capable of every wickedness. So this heresy hunting may continue under the guise of anything non-Christian can now be stigmatized as Satanism or of the devil. Those that can't make us, this is a Victor Hugo quote, those that can make us believe absurdities can make us commit atrocities. So this slide's a little out of place, but we'll deal with it as we go through this. But I'm going to state here that the light is at the center of the heart of darkness, which means in order to become enlightened, we have to do the shadow work. And that means understand that which is evil and operating in this world. And we have to understand that evil is not inherent to this world. Evil comes from men. Evil is ignorance of truth, the refusal of truth, which is turning your back on the Creator and the laws of creation. And of course, I'm getting this as a reference from Joseph Conrad's book, The Heart of Darkness, the most studied book in all universities throughout the world, and my favorite author as far as novella. But see, his novel is historically important as well, because it gives us a depiction of the 19th century Congo under Leopold. So, Heart of Darkness is essential reading. So what we're really dealing with is this polarity, and this goes into the earliest mythology in Egypt, with Horus representing the light and Set representing darkness. Of course, this is a solar cult aspect of the Egyptian mythos, and this tradition actually predates the solar phase. We're going to talk about that. But this idea that the devil is the adversary that must be destroyed, this is part of the human sickness. And the human sickness is so severe that few can bear it or bear to face it, but those that do will become well. I'm roughly trying to quote Vernon Howard. So we have the idea that this evil not only is inherent in the world, but that it must be destroyed, or this devil must be destroyed. And this is part of this sickness. It can only be dealt with on the internal level, at the individual level. So if we don't do the shadow work and deal with it internally, it's going to manifest externally, and then we're going to have to face it there. The more we understand this, the more we're going to understand that this is the basis for many, many stories and many, many novels and films, and just understand how this plays out in the modern world. The Setian principle is really just, well, the Horus principle is that which returns to source. That means raising in knowledge and understanding natural law, the laws of creation, fully raised. And that's represented astro-theologically as most high, which we're going to talk about. But evil is not a polarity of good. It's the result of ignorance. So when we understand, when we're studying all of the evils of government, just, and control systems, just have to understand that as bad as you've ever imagined that it could be, multiply that by infinity, is how corrupt it is and has the potential to be. So that's not really what's important. What's important is at what point do we start to care to understand truth and learn and deal with this internally before it manifests externally. So this Horus principle is that which returns to source, returns to light, returns to knowledge. So this Setian principle is resistance to truth, wants to stay in darkness. That which refuses to return to source. And we have this conundrum in a corruption form, is this Christ versus this Antichrist. But this adversary cannot be destroyed. It can only be bridled and dealt with internally. So belief, the problem with the belief system is if a belief system causes harm in the world, we don't really have the right to do it. You want to believe in the tooth fairy, that's fine. But if you want to believe in coercive government, that's not really a right to even have that as a belief, because that's going to lead to harm in the world. And to do this shadow work, the nature, the height that we know, or the depth that we know, doing the shadow work, the depth that we know evil is equal to the height at which we know good. So we have to keep that in mind. That's why the shadow work is so important. We're going to talk about that. But this idea of belief, another dangerous aspect of it is it constitutes the potential end of learning and arrestment of development. One of my favorite quotes is, "The fear of death is the beginning of slavery," Robert Anton Wilson. And another quote from Carlos Castaneda, "All the sorcerer has to do or need do is give you his mindset, which is to keep you in dual consciousness or cognitive dissonance." So the idea of this resurrection, it comes from the return of the sun and the solar doctrine and the return of this life-giving force. Set as Typhon in the Osirian myth was considered an evil power. And Typhon obviously is where we get the word typhoon. It's a destructive power. So Set as Typhon in the Osirian story is considered an evil power, a sort of devil of darkness. And the conflict between him and Horus was a struggle between light and darkness taking place in the twilight of evening and morning, or in the midwinter season, or at the equinoxes. Plutarch tells us how the evil Set, or Typhon, was humiliated and insulted by the Egyptians at certain festivals when they abused red-haired men because Set was red-haired. That's a whole different topic, but we're talking about how certain religions and certain traditions marginalize not only people but animals as well, and how people and animals have suffered the abuses of these perverted teaching. Set was the treacherous opponent of Horus. He was the Egyptian Judas. He betrayed his brother to his enemies, the Sabao. He was of red complexion, but the complexion and the red hair of Set were not derived from any human origin. Set was painted red or sandy as a representation of the desert. He was originally devil in the wilderness, the original devil in the wilderness, the cause of the drought, the darkness, and the creator of thirst. So in these religious traditions, certain things have been deemed unclean, and as a result, they have suffered abuses over the centuries. And this gives rise to what we know as this Faustian legend. So who is Faust? Faust is the protagonist of a classical German legend based on the historical Johann Georg Faust, 1480 to 1540. The erudite Faust is highly successful yet dissatisfied with his life, which leads him to make a pact with the devil, exchanging his soul for unlimited knowledge and worldly pleasures. The Faustian legend has been the basis for many literary, artistic, cinematic, musical works that have reinterpreted it through the ages. Faust and the adjective Faustian imply a situation in which an ambitious person surrenders moral integrity in order to achieve power and success for a delimited term. Faust is a tragic play by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, usually known in English as Faust Part 1 and Faust Part 2. Although rarely staged in its entirety, it is the play with the largest audience numbers on German language stages. Faust is considered by many to be Goethe's magnum opus and the greatest work of German literature. Goethe's Faust first appeared in print in 1790. The most important thing to remember here is that Goethe's Faust is the most popular account, partly due to the onset of the printing press, and that the legend predates even the account of Johann Georg Faust, circa 1480 to 1540. So this is an older legend, this Faustian legend, but Goethe's Faust is basically from the 18th century, considered to be the most popular. So it's the idea of selling the soul for materialism. See, this whole idea of this Western idealism and this Roman pragmatism. What's the problem with Roman pragmatism? Is that it basically is a utilitarianism. It's the most practical way to do things, but not necessarily the most moral way to do things. So if the railroad wants to go through your living room, then the most practical thing to do is just them to lay down the tracks and just demolish whatever's in its way. and that's not moral. So that's the problem with pragmatism. So this Western idealism is essentially this sway towards materialism and away from spirituality or spiritualism, selling the soul for materialism. This is the real selling of the soul. It's not about giving up all material belongings. It is, letting go of materialism is not about giving up all your material belongings. It's about letting go of the attachment to the physical world and understanding true value by understanding true purpose, which is to understand and discover the natural law and pass that knowledge forward to progeny and posterity. We are so much more than what we were ever taught. So this materialism and this shift towards materialism resulted in an ideology, what I refer to as the basis for the idea of all forms of coercive government, which we can call socialism. Any form of coercive government is a form of socialism. And that includes capitalism. Any form of socialist government, centralized control, is a form of socialism. So I'm saying that this dialectical materialism is really the underlying mindset that underlies this idea that we can have these coercive systems. And in a left brain imbalance, it's a random worldview, matters supreme, and or you could have the opposite of that, which is spirit is supreme. On either side, that's an imbalance. They represent an imbalance. So it's a form of cognitive dissonance. And in the random left brain worldview, the universe is a grand accident. Everything is just an accident. And in a right brain imbalance, this determinism, everything's preordained by God. Both of these ideas omit free will. So in fact, the real solution to that problem is that both these components are part of the makeup of the creation. So we have the random component, which is both of these ideologies omit free will. Well, free will is the random component, and determinism is the natural law, or the law of consequentialism. So in this imbalance, self-preservation, this materialism, self-preservation becomes the primary directive. Moral relativism is embraced, the idea that man can arbitrate right from wrong, or good from evil. Which leads to social Darwinism, which is basically survival of the most ruthless, or the most ruthless or psychopathic rises to the top. That's the modus operandi, and ultimately that leads to a God complex in the form of eugenics, which means not only deciding who lives and who dies, but when they live and when they die. Loss of the soul is loss of freedom for the entire species. It represents an extinction event. So the real selling of the soul and the price for the selling of the soul would result in an extinction event, because our freedom is inextricably connected, and without freedom we have no way to evolve on true spiritual lines and true human developmental lines. We will stagnate, we will go extinct. That was a difficult slide. Let's see what's coming up here. And these are just some examples of where we find this Faustian myth, and I'm sure there's thousands more. But there's many there, and we'll talk about a few of these. But the whole idea of this archetypal Christian devil is it's designed to stigmatize anything non-Christian. So that's part of this sickness. So here's an example of this Faustian legend in this film, Rosemary's Baby. Now I could talk about this for 2 hours or more, but this has so many implications, including what happened in the 60s and the early 1970s, and there's a lot going on. And everything In order to understand what's happening now, we have to understand what happened before now. And in order to understand what happened before now, we have to understand what happened before that. But in this Rosemary's Baby, let's assume that we're all familiar with this. She moves into this apartment. Her husband's career is on the wane. He basically makes some kind of a pact with these evil people, and all of a sudden his career takes off, and then she becomes pregnant and basically is manipulated by this elderly couple, and finds out, come to find out through, she has no knowledge, but that they're trying to incubate the son of Satan in her womb. And let me just say it this way, okay? Rosemary's Baby is an archetype for government or coercive control. Because coercive control is the great Satan, if there ever was such a thing. So if we understand it in that allegorical sense, we can make a lot more sense out of this. So when she's in that phone booth, or when she's trying to find anybody to listen to her story as she's fleshing this out, she finds out that they're all in on it together, And what that really is an allegory for is they're all statists. They're all sold on the idea of man's law. In order to establish man's law, we have to overthrow the laws of creation, which is the same as overthrowing the creator itself. And that's what pure Satanism is. One more thing about this slide, in the bottom right there, that's when she's in the phone booth. That gentleman there is William Castle. And most people don't seem to really understand or realize that this is William Castle's baby. This is his movie. Of course, all the credit was given to Roman Polanski. This is William Castle. Here's another example where we find this Faustian legend. This is another interesting film, and it's based on the true, or a legend of the late great Robert Johnson going down to the crossroads in Mississippi and striking this deal with this devil. And it's a great film. There's great guitar playing in this movie. This is an interesting film, and I recommend you check it out. The guitar playing in it is phenomenal. I'm trying to think of what else I want to say about this, but the main thing I want to mention here is this crossroads. Oh, yeah, well, the idea of the 27 Club, because Robert Johnson died at the age of 27, it came from this. And just keep that in mind. All these celebrities, particularly coming out of the 60s, dying at the age of 27, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, etc. So it's one of the popular conspiracies, but there does seem to be something to it. There's an unusual amount of popular musicians dying at the age of 27. And here's another movie. This one literally, he sells his soul for rock and roll. And the interesting thing about this movie is that God appears in the form in this film of God and as the adversarial devil. And it's also interesting that they go to Vegas to gamble for his soul. And God tries to win back his soul in a game of poker in Vegas, which is kind of interesting. I think of that as the one dividing into the two to understand the one, which gives us the three. There's a lot more to that, but keep that in mind. Carl Jung says, we need more understanding of human nature because the only real danger that exists is man himself. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied because we are the origin of all coming evil. Man is the origin of all coming evil. And we don't know enough about man, or at least if we did ever know enough about the psyche of man, which I'm going to tell you we did, that knowledge was lost in the sands of the Sahara. But see, it's possible to understand it now. So we have this one opportunity to recover it. We don't want to squander it. Because I consider Jungian and Freudian philosophy, the Vienna School, and the Jungian school, or the Vienna school and the Zurich school, to be psychology in its infancy. So we have to understand that the Egyptians were ancient cosmonauts, and the ancient psychology was their most advanced science. So when we're talking about ancient knowledge, we're talking about the ancient knowledge of psychology, not technology. The high science is psychology, and the Egyptians understood this well, and over the period of eons had developed the high science of psychology. So we'll talk about that some more. Now, one other interesting thing to distinguish the Zurich from the Vienna school is that it's about how they, Freud and Jung defined the term libido. And basically, that's what drives our behavior. This term is the idea of what drives our behavior. So, in the Freudian school, the Vienna school, the idea is that all drives are of a sexual drive or of a sexual nature. And in the Jungian school, the idea is that libido was determined by different stages of development, which Jung described as 3 or possibly 4 stages, but typically 3. So keep that in mind, because one thing to understand about this Freudian psychology is it created a cultural meme that did devastate the American society in less than 100 years, even more so than Christianity, I think. So keep that in mind. Yeah, we're going to talk about this movie, The Da Vinci Code, and this book, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. So this is a difficult subject. It's a little heady. I'm trying to get into this, but not too deep. But this is important because it deals with some of the earliest secret societies that we know of, including the Prior of Sion and Opus Dei, and of course the infamous Knights Templar. These are all heady topics, and these are all topics that require more time than we're going to be able to give them here, but we'll just keep moving forward and try to flesh this out. So there's a lot of peculiarities in this movie. The main thing I want to say about it is that it's based on the idea of better the devil that you know, because you have this horrible conspiracy that's created within this church by the church, dealing with esoteric knowledge that only the church is privy to. So therefore, they're the only ones that can deal with the problem. And this is the same idea with government. It's based on the idea of better the devil you know, or the lesser of 2 evils. And we have this idea of of this Priory of Sion as a secret order ordained by Rome, and the protection of the religion that they're using to basically control. And the Priory of Sion is considered to be one of the most ancient secret societies, and said to have leaders like Sir Isaac Newton and Da Vinci himself. And the fleur-de-lis is in their crest. They are guardians of the secret they supposedly refer to as the dark con of man. But what secret? The Priory of Sion protects the source of God's power on earth. And then he's talking about the Rosa lines, which is a reference to Rosicrucianism, and lines that go from the North to the South poles. Main thing I'd say about this is that the original prime meridian was Egypt, and it was moved 30 degrees west. Paris, that's primacy in the north. The P is primacy in the north single axe. So Polaris is a truncation of Paris is a truncation of Polaris. And they're talking about this particular church in Paris, in which they want to claim is the world's first prime meridian passes through. They're trying to obscure the fact that the world's first prime meridian is in Egypt and it was moved 30 degrees west. And that has to do with westing or materialism or Western idealism or Western civilization. So these are some heady topics, and I'm making some difficult points about them. As we go through this, hopefully we can better understand this material. So this character in this Da Vinci Code is Robert Langdon, played by Tom Hanks in the film. And Robert Langdon, in his discourse, he says, symbols are a language that can help us understand our past. As the saying goes, a picture says 1,000 words, but which words? Interpret for me, please, this first symbol. The first thing that comes to mind. The audience responds, hatred, racism, Ku Klux Klan. Robert Langdon, yes, interesting. But they would disagree with you in Spain. They were robes worn by priests. There. Now this symbol. Anyone? Crowd shouts, evil. Langdon, in English, please. Devil's pitchfork. Langdon, poor Poseidon. That is his trident, a symbol of power to millions of the ancients. Now this symbol, the audience. Madonna and child. Faith, Christianity. No, it's the pagan god Horus and his mother Isis, says Langdon. Centuries before the birth of Christ. Understanding the past determines actively our ability to understand the present. So how do we sift truth from belief? How do we write our own histories, personally or culturally, and thereby define ourselves? How do we penetrate years, centuries of historical distortion to find original truth? Tonight, this will be our quest. Robert Langdon. And I brought that along because I thought it was very profound, and it corresponds to what we're actually trying to do here. So part of what we're talking about is not only symbolism, but origins and pure forms of symbolism. There's no way we can understand symbolism in the modern world, which is largely corrupted forms of symbolism, without understanding them in pure forms, which we're only going to find in Egypt. And that's me saying that. So there was a conspiracy or this was actually a real lawsuit that the Da Vinci Code and Dan Brown had plagiarized this book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and certainly a lot of indications in the story that that's true, not to mention the fact that one of the main characters was named Saunier, based on this conspiracy that this Berenger Saunier had attended a church and uncovered some doctrines that revealed the knowledge of the origins of prior Scion and Opus Dei, and that led to the forming of the Templars. And I'm trying to fully flesh this out. This Rennes-le-Château, this church in Rennes-le-Château. Okay, let me go ahead and just read this. In the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, the author put forward a hypothesis that the historical Jesus married Mary Magdalene, had one or more children, and that those children or their descendants emigrated to what is now southern France. Once there, they intermarried with the noble families and would eventually become the Merovingian dynasty, whose special claim to the throne of France is championed today by a secret society called the Priory of Sion. They concluded that the legendary Holy Grail is simultaneously the womb of Mary Magdalene and the sacred royal bloodline she gave birth to. And this Rennes-le-Château is a hilltop village known internationally. It receives tens of thousands of visitors per year, drawn by conspiracy theories surrounding the putative buried treasure discovered by its 19th century priest Berenger Saunier, the precious nature of which is disputed among those who credit its existence. Francois Berenger Saunier was a Roman Catholic priest and lived 1852 to 1917 in the French village Rennes-le-Château, and was officially priest from 1885 to 1909. and transferred to another village by his bishop. He would be virtually unknown today, where he is not a central figure in the conspiracy theories surrounding Rennes-le-Chateau, from which the basis of several documentaries and books such as the 1982 Holy Blood, Holy Grail by Michael Bagent, Richard Lay, and Henry Lincoln. Elements of these theories were later used by Dan Brown in his best-selling 2003 novel, The Da Vinci Code, in which the fictional character Jacques Saunière is named after the priest, apparently. So, what they're trying to do here is reinvent the historical Jesus and claim that his bloodline has survived into the modern world and that Mary Magdalene had been his wife. Okay, so I want to tell you that this is just bolstering the idea of this historical Jesus to repackage and resell you the same solar doctrine, probably because it was waning in its potency. There's a lot more to it. But obviously, I can't remember the outcome of the lawsuit, but obviously, clearly, Dan Brown definitely stood on this book as a basis for some of his work. And that I would tell you that they both have a mutual interest, is to bolster an alternative account of the historical Jesus. See, the problem, if you want to have the historical Jesus, that's fine, as long as it doesn't arrest our development and truth discovery. Because there is an older tradition of the Christ that predates Roman Christianity. The Gnostic tradition, and before that, the Coptic Egyptians. So we'll talk about that some more. Let's just go forward here and see if we can flesh this out a little bit. So he uses the Da Vinci Code Last Supper to bolster his claim by saying that the figure to his left is a female, and that was actually Mary Magdalene, and that this is the Holy Grail. This is the chalice, this V symbol here, that is definitely a chalice, and that is a feminine principle. It's an equilateral inverted triangle, which is the feminine symbol. However, I would tell you that what they left out is that this is astro-theology, and that these represent the seasons of the annual cycle and the solar cycle. And that Jesus, the 13, you have the 12 and the 1, that's your 13. It's a very significant number. And I would tell you that these represent the Zodiac, in fact. So that's what they didn't tell you in the movie, because they're trying to resell you the historical idea and conceal the esoteric. See, they want to sell you the exoteric and have you externalize your faith instead of internalizing your work to know truth. So Job 38:11 is, and said, till now shall you come, but no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. So it means this far and no farther. And you see the fleur-de-lis there too, which is interesting. One other thing about Job is an interesting book, is that's where the devil first makes his appearance in the Bible. So this idea of this Holy Grail and all these clues laid down by this institution are just to get you on an Easter egg hunt or an endless search down rabbit holes of conspiracy or treasure hunting, and the idea of the search for the lost treasure of the Templars. It's all a diversion. It's all red herring to divert you away from understanding the true esoteric teaching that predates the Roman tradition that we know as Christianity. Oh, and the cryptex, the idea that the cryptex is used to keep secrets. It's a Da Vinci design. You write the information on papyrus scroll, which is then rolled around in a thin glass vial of vinegar. If you force it open, the vial breaks, vinegar dissolves the papyrus, your secret is lost forever. Well, first of all, the ancients that were trying to preserve this knowledge built the pyramids. because they wanted to build something robust that might survive. Before that, they stored the knowledge in the cosmos because they knew anything built on Earth could be destroyed. Luckily, the pyramids were not destroyed, but they still could be. So we have to keep that in mind. But I'm trying to tell you that the ancients would never store secrets in this way where they could be destroyed easily. So if it's a secret that could be destroyed that easily, it's not a secret that's worth knowing. And if it meant, you were going to lose your life if somebody found out you had it, that's not really how truth is. Truth isn't like something somebody can whisper in your ear and then all of a sudden you just run away with this secret and you know all that is. No, truth is a lifetime study and desire to know truth and resist slavery in the form of government. That's what true spirituality is. So these Knights Templars were hailed as heroic warrior monks. The Knights Templar ended up branded as heretics and burned at the stake. And the date's ambiguous, but it's said to have happened on Friday the 13th in 1307. I might take umbrage with the exact date, but I would say that the Friday the 13th part is accurate because, like I said, that 13, there's something significant about that. And Friday is a feminine day to Freya, the Norse god. Freya, it's a feminine. So this idea of the Grail is the feminine. It's the feminine principle. It's not a religious artifact. It's about finding your care, connecting to your heart energy. The main thing let's understand about the Knights is following the Third Crusades, anybody in the knighthood was raised to the sovereignty of the king and given clemency. So there's a lot, the Templars is a huge subject, and it's one of the most fascinating studies that you'll ever undertake. And I don't have all the time to go into this, but I'd like to try to make a few points about it. The fact that we have this term night is a reference to the opposite of day. So let's keep that in mind, because we're going to talk more about that. And the knights are a phenomenon that emerged from the Dark Ages in medieval times. But this idea that they still exist, sure, you could still have an order that existed, but it wouldn't be the same men, so let's not get too confused about that. And this order was said to have been founded to protect the pilgrims. Okay, so this word pilgrim is ambiguous. Like I say, what they've done is they've externalized your faith to obscure internalizing your work. So this idea of pilgrim really is a reference to initiate. So, we think of the typical pilgrim dress as kind of like Amish people or even Jewish rabbis. I would tell you that's a corruption of the esoteric tradition and an externalized idea that at some point in your life you needed to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, when the Holy Land, or the New Jerusalem, which means new kingdom, is your high place in your consciousness. It's an internal pilgrimage to initiate yourself on the journey. The picture of this paradise in Hebrew writing, the Psalms, Book of Isaiah, Zechariah, and Revelation were pre-extant long ages earlier as Egyptian. What the so-called prophets of the Jews did was to make sublunary the vision of the good time in another life. There were always two Jerusalems from the time when Judea and Palestine were appendages of Egypt. Two Jerusalems were recognized by Paul, one terrestrial, one celestial. The name of Jerusalem we read in the Aru Salem, or fields of peace, in the heaven of the never-setting stars. The burden of the Jewish prophecy, which turned out so terribly misleading for those who were ignorant of the secret wisdom, is that the vision of this glorious future should be attained on earth, whereas it never had that meaning. Thus, Jerusalem on earth was to take the place of Jerusalem above, and the Eru Hetep became Jerusalem simply as a mundane locality. So these Templars were said to have traveled, and they were supposed to be a group of 9, to protect all these pilgrims making this pilgrimage into this Holy Land. And, first of all, how could 9 knights protect all of these so-called pilgrims coming in? And in the Da Vinci Code, they're talking about they had gone and they were excavating underneath the temple, and then all of a sudden one day they stopped and returned to Rome, and then at that point were accused of heresy by Clement V, and then basically arrested, rounded up, and executed, and then most of the rest of them fled to Scotland. So it's a long story, it's a big story, and it's a huge conspiracy, and it's also our first contact with what we think of as these secret societies. But I would tell you that these Templars were excavating under the temple because they had discovered the rites of Eleusis, which is the Egyptian rites at Delphi, which were basically a salvation of the Egyptian tradition of Osiris, which was a practice of venerating in the night sky under the temple in corridors which went under the temple as a representation of the underworld. There's a lot to that, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So the Templars excavated under the Temple Mount so they could practice their now found rites. The ritual of Osiris at night underneath the temple. The same is found in Pt2 and Eleusis. Michael Andrew Ramsay, a Scottish gentleman, in a discourse delivered in Paris in 1740, suggested that the possibility of a fraternity having its origin in the time of the Crusades among the Knights Templar, and explains it in this way. The Pope Clement V and Philip le Bel, King of France, feared the power of the Templars, who were given, clemency and free reign to roam anywhere they wanted in Europe. They were basically raised to the sovereignty of the king, and they are said to have been the origins of the world's first banking system and traveler's checks. So, and the Knights Malta were just a defect of the Templars when they were accused of heresy, and they set up a stronghold of Malta. There's a lot more to it. I'm not going to try to go into the details of this because apparently not going to have enough time today. So that Pope Clement V and Philip le Bel, King of France, fearing the power of the Templars and coveting their immense wealth, resolved to destroy the order. They wanted to renege on their debts. So keep that in mind. When in 1308, Jacques de Molay, then Grand Master of the order, was preparing for an expedition to avenge the wrongs and disasters suffered by the Christians in the East, the Pope, the sovereign power to which, in the spiritual, the Templars owed allegiance, enticed him to France. On his arrival, he was received with every mark of friendship, but soon after, the king caused him to be arrested, together with some of the other dignitaries, accusing them of the most heinous crimes, imputing to them the secret rites of their initiation. By order of the Archbishop of Sens and his provincial council, Jacques de Molay, Guy of Auvergne, Auvergne, I can't pronounce it, and several other officers were burned alive on the 18th of March, 13th, and 14th. The Pope, by bull dated the 2nd of April and published the 2nd of May, 1312, that he issued on his own responsibility, the Council of Vienna and Dauphin, being the adverse to hasty measures, declared the order abolished throughout the world. The execution of the Grand Master and his companions gave the coup de grace to the order, but some of the knights who had escaped to Portugal continued the order. They assumed the title of Knights of Christ, which the order still bears, I suppose, today. Jacques de Molay, before his death, had appointed Johann Marcus Larmenio as his successor to the office of Grand Master. The knights who, fleeing from their persecution, had taken refuge in Scotland at the court of King Robert Bruce, refused to recognize his authority and pretended to reestablish the order of the temple under his allegory, and the title of architects, protected by the king, laid the foundation of the order of the free and accepted Masons of the Scottish Rite in 1314. The new society soon forgot the meaning of the executory oath, and the members were obliged to take at their initiation the death of Clement V, Philip le Bel, of the accusers and enemies of Jacques de Molay, and the other knights who had been executed, having removed the object of their vengeance, still continued to decorate their lodges and tokens commemorative of the death of the Grand Master, and to impose all new members the obligation of avenging it, which they signified by striking with an unsheltered dagger at unseen beings, his supposed murders. This allegory is well known to the Knights of Kadosh. A century had scarcely elapsed when the idea was abandoned. The founders and their disciples having passed away, their successors saw only allegories in the symbols of the order, and the extensive use of the words and texts taken from the Bible were introduced. Basically, this is from the Arcana of Freemasonry by Albert Churchward, some of it at least. But this is a difficult subject. So we have these Templars fleeing the persecution of the church into Scotland, and then we see these cathedrals or these temples being built, well, primarily the Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century by the Sinclair family, combines both pagan and Christian symbolism. So we have this Eastern tradition coming into the West. It's very interesting. And then they said because it was deteriorating, they had to go in there and do this restoration, which basically ended up obscuring all of the pagan symbolism, or a lot of the symbolism. So it's a big subject, and it's something that we have to deal with. So these Knights Templars, we've talked about the historical function of the secret societies, and we're talking about, these are corruptions of these secret societies that they want to keep us in this tiny 3,000-year box. And all of the conspiracies and all of the secret societies and everything that we can know has to exist inside that box. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the secret societies far, far predate even dynastic Egypt. The real secret societies and the first contingencies for knowledge being lost far anterior to dynastic Egypt. The Iron Knights of Christ, the knighthood was declared sovereign, raised the status of kingship. Knighthood was declared sovereignty, raised the status of kingship. When dealing with any secret society, we are dealing with a hidden history, therefore we must understand classical history. The origin of Freemasonry is one of the most interesting subjects to which the Masonic student can apply his time and talent. There are authors who attribute the origin of modern Freemasonry to followers of Pythagoras, because some of his speculations of that philosopher concerning the meaning of numbers are to be found in the esoteric doctrines taught in Masonic lodges. Others, on account of the Christian symbols that have been incorporated in the decorating of things pertaining to Masonry, follow the Swedish system and say that the Essenes and the first Christians founded it. Others, again, make it originate in the building of Solomon's Temple. Many Jewish names, emblems, and legends taken from the VSL have found their way into the rites and initiation in several degrees, and others state that it goes back farther to Adam. Ask why they do not know. Thomas Paine and those of his school say that the Druids were the fathers of the craft. They, being supposed worshippers of the sun, moon, and stars, these jewels of the firmament being represented on the ceilings of the Masonic temples. Many of the old Jewish priests joined the Christian church and were so-called Chaldees, but although they had joined the Christian church, they kept themselves very much aloof for a long period up to the 12th century, which means they stayed informed. These were the last remnants of the old Jewish Druid priests, descendants of their Egyptian brethren who practiced their pure eschatology of their forefathers. Gradually, they all died out as a separate and distinct class, and those who remained were merged into Christianity. So basically, the Druids were part of the mysteries surviving into the modern world. That's what we're trying to get to, is how did the ancient knowledge survive into the modern world because of the resilient cultures in Northern Europe and Britain, and because the stonemasons unwittingly and the cathedral builders unwittingly brought the Eastern traditions into the West and their architecture and their implementation, and that ultimately, if this weren't the case, we would not have this knowledge at our access today. And there's a lot more to say about it because this is a huge subject. So I can't make it the whole center of my talk, but it's a big part of it because as far as we know, this is the origin of the earliest secret society. So in this King Arthur Arthurian tradition, we have this round table. And notice the one in the top left there, that has a stylized rose in the center, which I would tell you is the red rose of York and the white rose of Lancaster, because it's about the War of the Roses. And then that's basically Henry V positioned himself there as most high, and this ornate round table. And again, we have this Holy Grail because that's infused into the Arthurian legend. So the allegory of the round table, as the name suggests, has no head, so it represents equal status. But I would tell you that basically it's an archetype of the Zodiac. As its name suggests, the round table has no head. Everyone who sits there has equal status. The most common accounts fix the number of knights who could be seated at one time at the round table at either 12 or 24. The 12 signifies the signs of the Zodiac, also the apostles of Jesus. When 24 are shown seated at the table, each of the 12 signs of the Zodiac is divided into two parts, a light half and a dark half, to signify the nocturnal phases of each sign. So the 24 nights represents the 24 hours of the day, the 24 elders before the throne in Revelation, the 24 Persian deities who represent the spirits of the divisions of the day. There was also a mysterious empty seat called the Siege Perilous, Throne of Peril, in which one might sit except he who was successful in his quest for the Holy Grail. In the personality of Arthur is found a new form of the ever-recurrent cosmic myth. Arthur is the sun. His knights, which are the Zodiac, and his sword may be the sun's ray with which he vanquishes the dragons of darkness, and it may represent the Earth's axis. Arthur's round table is the universal and siege perilous, and is the throne of the perfected man. In its terrestrial sense, Arthur was the Grand Master of a secret Christian Masonic brotherhood of philosophic mystics who termed themselves knights. He received the exalted position of Grand Master because he had faithfully accomplished the withdrawal of his sword spirit from the anvil base metals, his lower natures. As invariably happens, the historical Arthur was soon confused with the allegories and myths of his orders, and now the two are inseparable. After Arthur's death, his great sword Excalibur was cast back into the waters of eternity, which is a vivid portrayal of the ascent of cosmic night at the end of the day universal manifestation. The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. This is the second movie in the Robert Langdon series based on an earlier work from Dan Brown called Angels and Demons. And this deals with the CERN-Hadron Collider, which is very controversial. And one thing I would say about this that needs to be understood is that a corpuscle is a negative particle of electricity that can exist alone, 1/1000th the size of an atom, with a velocity of about 100,000 miles per second, and can penetrate the thickest block of steel. An atom is made up of two or more corpuscles surrounded by positive electricity. A positive particle of electricity cannot exist alone. Now, in this movie, we have the anagrams and ambigrams. So I wanted to say, in the first movie, we know we're dealing with esoteric knowledge. And for instance, the name of the secondary character who is alleged to be the bloodline of Jesus, her name is Sophie Nouveau, which I would interpret as new knowledge. So that is bolstering their conspiracy that this discovery that Jesus had been married to Mary Magdalene and that they had children together is the new knowledge that they're referring to, all as a means of bolstering their claim to the historical Christ. Because the claim to the historical Christ is what gives them control of the papal seat, or the Roman authority, let's say. In this movie, we have some ambigrams and anagrams. An ambigram is a word, art form, or other symbolic representation whose elements retain meaning when reviewed or interpreted from a different direction, perspective, or orientation, whereas an anagram is a word, phrase, or name formed by rearranging the letters of another, such as cinema or Iceman. So, for instance, Horus is an anagram for hours. And we've seen this stylized spelling of this Illuminati. And we can see if that's inverted upside down, it would appear exactly the same. And they're using anagrams to flesh out in the film or in the story, to flesh out clues to solve this second mystery. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but I want to talk about this idea of this Illuminati, because this is a popular conspiracy that when people hear the name secret society, or dark occult, they immediately think Illuminati. Okay, Illuminati implies enlightened. Anybody who's trying to control the extant, or supporting or partaking in coercive systems of government or coercive systems of control, cannot truly be illuminated, because they're in fear. So Johann Adam Weishaupt, born 1748 to 1830, died 1830, was a German philosopher, professor, and founder of the Order of the Illuminati, a secret society at a time, however, when there was no end of making game and of abusing secret societies. I plan to make use of this human fable for a real and worthy goal for the benefit of people. I wish to do what the heads of the ecclesiastic and secular authorities ought to have done by virtue of their offices. On May 1st, 1776, Johann Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati in the electorate of Bavaria. He adopted the name Brother Spartacus, interesting, within the order. Even encyclopedia references vary on the goal of the order, such as New Advent saying that the order was not equalitarian or democratic internally, but sought to promote the doctrines of equality and freedom throughout society. While others, like Collier's, have said that the aim was to combat religion and foster rationalism in its place. The actual character of the society was an elaborate network of spies and counter-spies, each isolated cell of initiates reported to a superior who they did not know, a party structure that was effectively adopted by some later groups. Weishaupt was initiated into the Masonic Lodge Theodor zum Guten Rat at Munich in 1777. His project of illumination, enlightening the understanding by the sun of reason, which will dispel the clouds of superstition and of prejudice, and was an unwelcome reform. He used Freemasonry to recruit for his quasi-Masonic society with the goal of perfecting human nature through re-education to achieve a communal state with nature, freed of government and organized religion, presenting their own system as pure Masonry. Weishaupt and Adolf Freiherr Knege, who organized his ritual structure, greatly expanded the secret organization. Weishaupt's radical nationalism and vocabulary were not likely to succeed. Writings that were intercepted in 1784 were interpreted as seditious. and the society was banned by the government of Karl Theodor, Elector of Bavaria, in 1784. Weishaupt lost his position at the University of Ingolstadt and fled Bavaria. So the controversy about this Weishaupt's Illuminati is ambiguous, to say the least. But what we have to be careful with is that it doesn't marginalize the true intention of the real secret societies, which were, if it's really truly beneficent, it's endeavoring to preserve and recover what had been lost in the mystery schools of Egypt. And regarding the mystery schools of Egypt, let's consider that most of what we have regarding what we know about Egypt came from Neoplatonism, and that the truth that and the knowledge that had been lost is far, far anterior to even dynastic Egypt. Ideally, we have to understand the evolution of Egyptian mythology, what we can term the evolution of the mythos. If we don't understand the evolution of the mythos, we're grasping at straws. We're right back to our same superstitious notions because we don't understand the truth of the matter. And I included another ambigram there. That's faith. And just so we could take a look at it, but clearly that would read the same if it were inverted. So let's move forward. Now, what I found interesting about this image is we can see it is an ambigram. And we can also see that the picture, which appears to be a reflection on the water, is reflecting what appears to be above it. And that's very significant, especially when we consider this title, because we have this upper half of the circle, which is impressed there by the sun, or imaged there by the outline of the sun, and then the lower half of this circle. Because what I want to tell you is that when we're talking about the sun's path through the zodiac, we're not talking about astrology. We're talking about astro-theology, which is an ancient science of astronomy, but had been divinized in the mythology. And the mythology is the expression of this cycle. So two of the dilemmas in modern thought is that we don't understand the science itself, which has a lot to do with astronomy, and that everything the Egyptians in the Egyptian knowledge and science, it was all corresponding. So their mythology corresponds to their science, and so we have two things that are not understood in the modern world. We don't understand the science, nor do we understand the expression of the science. One of the things that makes the science difficult to understand is that the expression of the science to understand is that it changed over a long period of time. So as the mythos evolved, the expression of the science was changing. So the only way to really understand that is to understand it in its earliest, purest forms, and then understand why it's changing, and then we can start to examine how it's changing. So we're going to be talking here about the expression in the solar doctrine or the solar cycle, because it's dealing with what we can call waxing and waning angles of the sun. So it's very important to stay oriented geographically. We have to stay oriented geographically. So when we're understanding this, and we have to stay oriented astronomically as well, understanding what stars are visible, etc. There's a lot to it. And it's no easy thing to do, so let's not make that mistake. We can't just think that, well, we haven't figured it out in 5 seconds. We got to throw our arms up in the air here. So I wanted to show you here that this is where we get this idea of angels. It's based on waning angles or waxing angles. And that on the left side of this photo, I'm calling that the good angels, because these are the angels that are resurrecting or returning to life or have resurrected from death. Typically, the waning angles would start at the winter solstice, and then the waxing angles would begin at the summer solstice, where the sun begins its fall. So as the sun begins its fall, we can call that the bad angles. And those can go all the way down to the winter solstice. And the good angels could come all the way up to the, starting from the winter solstice, depending on geographically how we're oriented. But what I'm trying to show us here is that everything in the underworld cycle represents the underworld, as we saw in the picture with Mary and her rosary beads. They make this form of this lower half of this cycle, which typifies the spiritual realm of the underworld that the mains must travel through. So at the bottom of the photo there, I'm calling this everything in these angles below the horizon there are demons, and everything above are angels, and there's good angels and bad angels, if you will. And here I just wanted to show us the zodiacal significance of this. So it's very interesting. So there's no question that whoever's working on this film has at least some of this type of esoteric knowledge. And they don't reveal that in the story or in the film. So let's keep that in mind. And here we can get a better look at this zodiac with the upper half. And this is based on primacy in the north, because the sun comes into the north at spring equinox and then falls back into the south at the autumn equinox. But it's this lower half of this cycle that corresponds to the journey through the underworld, and the upper half corresponds to immortal life, birth, growth, decay. And birth, growth, decay applies not only to the entire upper half of the cycle, but it can also apply to a single house or three houses. And in other words, Aries, Taurus, Gemini can be birth, growth, decay. Cancer, Leo, Virgo can be birth, growth, decay, because Aries is a cardinal sign, Taurus is a fixed sign, and Gemini is a mutable sign. And we'll be talking about that some more. So what are the mystery traditions? Well, these are the three most popular, well-known mystery traditions. Freemasonry on the left, Tarot in the center, and then Kabbalah on the right. And I wanted to show there's ubiquity here in the form of these pillars, and that they each represent these three pillars. And in order to understand the three pillars, we first have to understand the two in balance, because without the two in balance, we don't have a third pillar. So mystery traditions are absolutely something that we need to learn and understand even before we go deeper into the aspects of any science. And there's a lot to it, and we'll be fleshing out a little bit more about that as we go. So in the modern world, we still have these secret societies attached to these universities. And here's 4 examples that we have at the Yale University: the Skull and Bones, the Scroll and Key, Wolf's Head, and Berzelius. And these produce some of the, out of these come some of the most powerful people in the world, and they are shaping policy, and they are shaping how our world is operated and run today. And we have these social engineers, so what we have to understand is that originally the sacred sciences are based on agriculture. So in the allegorical sense of the spiritual matter, it's about when to plant and when to harvest, that we must reap before we sow in order to prepare for the afterlife is the sowing during life, and then the reaping of the afterlife, where we get the term the grim reaper. And there's a lot to that. I don't want to fully open that all up right now, but it's very important to understand. And social engineering is very important to understand. Another term for that is mind control, how the influences in the propaganda and the media are manipulating people's minds to believe and think a certain way. And then that allows them to forward what otherwise might be considered unpopular or unacceptable policy. And we need to think of it like this, because what we're dealing with ultimately are shareholders, and when they make their investments, that's the planting of their crops, and then they try to manipulate the environment to fertilize their crops and ensure a bountiful harvest, which is, let's say, profit, but ideally what their ambition is control. For the Gnostics, the Christ story was the cover story, exoteric, accessible to the masses, and was considered to be part of the pre-initiation process before delving into the deeper mysteries. So you couldn't be, as we had discussed, accepted into any mystery school until you had chosen a faith, because they were not interested in bringing anybody that was considered to be atheist, which they would consider unteachable, into the mystery schools. Before beginning the esoteric degrees, one must first learn the exoteric cover story, and then, once taken into mystery schools, you could be given the tools to flesh out the deeper spiritual meaning of your exoteric doctrine, to receive the esoteric teaching of true spirituality and the true science of natural law, ideally. And another thing we have to understand is, we're talking about, when we think of rites and rites inside of a mystery school, there's different types of rites, and we need to at least have some discernment about this, because ideally what we would have to be trying to get to, the only thing that we could really be receiving in the mystery schools that was of any real true value, is clues as to what our lost history is, and clues to what the lost science itself is. So we have to keep that in mind, that there's different types of rites. There's fraternal rites, which are exclusive to a particular fraternity, and they're arbitrary. They're arbitrated by the order or the leaders of that fraternity. Initiatory rites are exclusive to a fraternity or exclusive to a particular tradition, and arbitrary or orthodox based on how somebody is initiated or brought into that fraternity. Totemic rites are the earliest expression of fertility rites or religion, or the origins of our earliest religious thought. We have to understand that man's earliest religious ideas are the foundations of our earliest sciences. It is what led to the development and the evolution of the human brain. Understand that up to a point we have autonomous evolution, and then at a certain point, when man applies reason, that he becomes responsible for his own evolution, and that all evolution in his development that happened after that was caused by him, and caused by the earliest ideas, which were religious. So ideally, it's all about fertility rites, because fertility rites in relation to agriculture is the main foundations of the earliest sciences and the earliest mythology. So unless we understand fertility rites, we will live in pure forms. We will live in a world filled full of religious dogma. And then we have the pyramid text in the Book of the Dead, or the oldest funerary text in papyrus. So what we have to understand also is that the most ancient ideas, anything in a textual form, has already been interpreted and arbitrated, which means it has potential to be ambiguous, and it has potential to be misinterpreted or mistranslated, because the earliest preservation of this knowledge never existed in a textual form. So only by learning the symbolism and reading the symbolism could we ever hope to flesh this out and interpret it properly. And ideally, what I'm saying, see, I don't have any oaths, but I've been studying Freemasonry for quite a while, and my conclusion is that it is the ritual of Osiris in its purest form is probably the most important thing that you would receive at the higher degrees of Freemasonry. And as to how that would benefit the individual versus benefit the society are two different things, because this knowledge can be used for good or evil. It can be used to educate and uplift each other, or it can be used to enslave and control each other. And we can't really know who's in the White Lodge or who's in the Black Lodge. And anybody that's in the White Lodge can join the dark side, and I suppose vice versa, but not very likely. So one thing we have to understand is that all new religions endeavor to obliterate all traces of their predecessors. And this was especially prominent in what I call the solar doctrine. And that the solar doctrine, or the solar phase of the Egyptian mythology, has been happening for 100,000 years. And that the cult of Osiris happened roughly right in the center of that. It began about 60,000 years ago and ended about 40,000 years ago. So, right in the center of the cult of Osiris is the center of the solar doctrine. And the thirst for power is never satisfied. It is always insatiable, both in men and nations. When Rome was the mistress of the world, the emperors caused themselves to be worshipped as gods. The Church of Rome claimed despotism over the soul and over the whole life from the cradle to the grave. It gave and sold absolutions for past and future sins. It claimed to be infallible in matters of faith. And also decimated America to convert its indigenous people. So it sold absolutions, not just to the individual, but also it could sell absolutions for their dead relatives or their relatives. So my claim is that everything in the modern world is post-Osiris. Now, obviously, that's true. If Osiris existed, everything that existing now. But what I'm really saying is that nothing that predated Osiris is essentially left. It's all been obliterated. However, it's because of the pyramids that we still have a chance to understand what happened before Osiris. So this is a solar cult, and following the cult of Osiris, it became even more aggressive, obliterating. It was the most aggressive phase of this solar cult to destroy all traces of their predecessors. And following the cult of Osiris, it only descended into more fervor to accomplish this. And Christianity being the most blatant of the perpetrators, endeavoring in this type of obliteration of ancient traditions that predate it. Because they're selling you a new doctrine. They want to obliterate anything that would challenge their dogmatic doctrines. So I keep moving forward here. Now, this is dealing and showing us just some idea of what this evolution of this mythos is. And I'm claiming that from 100,000 years ago to the present, we've been in this solar cult. And that their religion and the Christianity is the pinnacle of this solar cult. It's the most modern form of this solar cult. And that the sun is their associated revered celestial object, and the cross is their major symbol. And from 150,000 years ago to 100,000 years ago, we were in the lunar phase. These are both annual cycles. And before that, we didn't venerate anything dealing with constellations west to east or east to west. And that in the lunar cult, in the modern world, what's left of the tenets of that is assigned to what we know as Islam. And the symbol of the crescent moon, which is typically a lunar symbol, was ultimately handed to Venus. So that doesn't just represent the moon, the crescent of the moon, because that knowledge was transferred into Venus, which is always shown in an eternal crescent and never shown in a whole aspect, and represents what we know as the lux ferae, the bringer of the light. And that's a feminine principle. And from 600,000 years ago to 150,000 years ago, which is when the pyramids were built, 150,000 years ago, we were in this stellar cult. And prior to that, we're coming from the totemic sociology. And they venerated everything in southern and then ultimately northern circumpolar constellations. And that became associated with Saturn as the base of the ladder in the Elohim. So an inversion of that is to put Saturn at the top of the ladder. And that's where we get this idea of the cult of the black sun. or that Saturn corresponds to the idea of the black sun. So we're talking about different phases of expression in ancient sciences, as well as the expression of the science and the science itself. So the only true divisions are pre-totemic, totemic non-hero cult, hero cult, which are stellar, lunar, and solar. Stellar, let's say at least 300,000 years ago to 150,000 years ago. Lunar 150 to 100,000 years ago, solar to 100,000 years ago to present. And then during the solar cult begins basically with cult of the Sphinx, which was built to typify the double horizon. So it's facing west to east, where the sun will rise in the east. Now, obviously, there's controversy about whether or not it was built in its present form, or that if it had been changed and had been a different form in its beginnings. And I talked about that in my first presentation. Following the cult of the Sphinx, we had the cult of Ptah lasting 10,000 years, which took us into the cult of Amen-Ra, which lasted 20,000 years. And that's significant because everything before the cult of Amen-Ra, the spiritual realm, was venerated in the night sky. So everything after Amen-Ra, we're dealing with this conundrum and this struggle to venerate in day sky versus venerating in night sky. And then the cult of Osiris follows the cult of Amen-Ra, and there's a struggle in the priest class to take it back into night sky, and then they begin this practice of actually venerating underneath of the temples. And then following that, we have the cult of eschatology lasting 20,000 years. So everything after Osiris, see, I'm trying to say that the mythology had been perfected in the solar doctrine in the cult of Amen-Ra. And then the eschatology, which means final things, what we deal with post-mortem, for instance, the eschatology was perfected during the cult of Osiris. And then everything, so what does that mean? It means that everything after Osiris was a downgrade all the way into the modern world. And then following the cult of eschatology, we enter into the dynastic period, which lasted roughly 16,000 years. And then basically classical history picks up there and has lasted roughly 2,800 years. Modern Egyptologists exhibit Osiris as the first of the Egyptian divinities, when in fact he is the last in line. And the 5 family members of Osiris, they originally represented the 5 extra days of the year, so a 360-degree circle or cycle, plus 5 days added, and those days were preserved for venerating these 5 mysterious days and the 5 spirits in correspondence. So there's a lot to that. And, I'd like to give you the entire discourse, but that's not going to happen today. But we'll keep working on this material because I understand it's difficult and very new to many people. So keep moving forward here. So who was Serapis? Well, before I get into that, let me just say that ancient temples were a place of learning and understanding. Modern temples are a place of believing and conforming, and there's quite a difference. Serapis is a Greco-Egyptian deity. The cult of Serapis was introduced during the 3rd century BC on the orders of Pharaoh Ptolemy Soter of the Ptolemaic kingdom as a means to unify the Greeks and Egyptians in his realm. A Serapeum was any temple or religious precinct devoted to Serapis. The cultus of Serapis was spread as a matter of deliberate policy by the Ptolemaic kings, who also built the immense Serapeum of Alexandria. Serapis continued to increase in popularity during the Roman Empire, often replacing Osiris as the consort of Isis in temples outside of Egypt. So a lot of people may not know about Serapis. It's very important to understand. Following the 2nd century, Christians killed Christians by the countless thousands. Gnostics and everything pagan was wiped out. The Serapeum, Alexandria's temple of Osiris, and its great library go up in flames, and what replaced the ancient systems of knowledge and gnosis was blind faith, which eventually led to the monks and aesthetic dryness of the establishment. that coercively imposed their doctrines and dogmas on the population. A Serapeum is a temple or other religious institution dedicated to the syncretic Greco-Egyptian deity Serapis, who combined aspects of Osiris and Apis the bull in a humanized form that was accepted by the Ptolemaic Greeks of Alexandria. So this Apis the bull and this symbol of the bull is a big part of how the eschatology became mingled with the mythology. Because originally bull represented a feminine aspect, a nurturing aspect. And then when that was replaced with the charging aspect of the masculine principle, that represents a mingling of the mythology and the eschatology and a corruption of the pure form of the spiritual realm, and the aspect of the mystery schools represented a feminine aspect. A lot to it. So what is eschatology? So, in the modern world, we have this dichotomy of heaven and hell. And then this is getting everybody to focus their sights on the afterlife and then neglecting what's happening here. As we stated earlier, to the Egyptians, they had two tenets. Ignorance was the only evil, and that what happens here matters. So this is part of what led to this. And this happened over a long period of time, this corruption of the mythology and this eschatology. But this is what it looks like in our modern world today. So here's a couple definitions I brought. Eschatology, the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind, final things. Mythology is a collection of myths, especially one belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. That's mythology. And then myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. Mythology, a collection of myths, especially one belonging to a particular religious or cultural tradition. Eschatology, the part of theology concerned with death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and of humankind, final things. So one thing I wanted to tell you is that if we study the Greek myths, these are basically provided to us by Homer, and that's where we pick up with classical history, and that all the Greek culture had been based on the heroes from the Homeric myth. And Homer only makes a mere mention of Hades, which corresponds to our modern day hell. And then we have Virgil basically giving us a Roman variant of the Homer. But in the Virgil, we get more of the description of the roasting of the flesh and the screaming of the torment. And we see this detail of this hell starting to emerge. And then by the time we get to the modern scriptures, that's eternal torment and hellfire. So that's, again, something that we need to keep in mind. But as I said earlier, the depths to which we know evil will equal the heights to which we know good. And I brought along this Khalil Gibran quote to just help drive this point home, and it's quite poetic and beautiful. It says, "But I say that even as the holy and righteous cannot rise above the highest which is in each of you, so the wicked and the weak cannot fall lower than the lowest which is in you also." Khalil Gibran. So in order to understand mythology, all mythology, if we study the Roman mythology in the Greek, or if we study European mythology in the Greek dress, or if we study American mythology or South American mythology in the Greek or in the Roman, it's not going to reveal anything to us. If we study the Norse and the Celtic dress, or if we study the Celtic and the Greek dress, it's not going to reveal what we need to understand. This is why it's called comparative mythology or comparative religion. It has to be studied eclectically across the whole spectrum of mythology and culture. But ideally, we're going to learn that only until we study it in the Egyptian is it going to unravel. John Anthony West says, "If you try to describe moonbeams to the blind, you'll get nowhere. If you try to describe sex to eunuchs, they'll get angry." So you cannot talk about an esoteric tradition to the emotionally defective and the spiritually dyslexic. which is par to the great problem of conveying this information to the academic world, because that is what most of the academic world consists of. Late great John Anthony West. And his work was mostly championing Schwaller de Lubec's work, which I have some reverence for, and found some very interesting information in his work through John Anthony West. So people have this misconception that Egypts were obsessed with death, or just so afraid of death that they created these religions to deal with it. And this is the actual Book of the Dead. It's actually known as the Papyrus of Ani, and it's an ideographic image that was taken from the walls of a temple in Egypt. And John Anthony says, when death is regarded not, as with us, as an ultimate dissolution, but rather as a transitional and crucial stage of a journey, then the apparent Egyptian preoccupation with death becomes exactly the opposite of what it seems to be. It is, in fact, a preoccupation with life in the deepest possible sense. Okay, this ritual is what we're looking at here, and this ritual can be acted out. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And we see there the weighing of the heart with Anubis and Ibis and Set, and there's a lot to this, and there's a lot of ambiguous translations to it. I would tell you that partly it's a zodiac, but there's a lot more to it. The ritual describes the ways of darkness in the entrance of the Tuat as the tunnels of Set, which show that a way to the netherworld was made by Set, and the primal paradise went down with him into the abyss, which was from the beginning situated in the south, where the Egyptians superlatively localized the Tuat, or entrance to the underworld, which was also the place of egress for the life that came into the world by water from the recesses of the south. It is certain that in one phase they imaged Set as going down south to some sort of underworld, and thus he became the representative of the power of darkness. In the eschatology, he is Ap-Uat, or the jackal, as the conductor of the souls, the opener of the ways, the seer in the dark. It's the idea that the dog is a spiritual guardian. And the two forms of the jackal, that of the south and north, now become the guide of the southern ways, or the nether world, and as the opener of the northern ways to the summit of the mount, the pole star or paradise of the north, with Horus as god of that paradise. The scene had now shifted from south to north, and all the attributes which had belonged to Set were transferred to Horus. The two gods were really one, the ritual proves, till when it mentions the two Horuses, it was the one god who had changed his abode in the south and gone into the north. In other words, they had transferred paradise from the south to the north and represented by their astro-mythology. But it was now the one god of all the time. Different types were now given, in which Set is depicted as ever warring against Holmes, one of the zoo-type form, and later assumed the anthropomorphic, which means fully personified. So ideally, because this mythology had begun basically in southern Egypt, as it moved north, Set had been original primary deity, god of the South Pole, and then they brought it all, stored it into the North Pole. And then that's part of where we get this struggle and this dichotomy between Horus and Set. And there's a lot more to it. We try to find a way to try to better explain that as we move forward through this. But part of this is in my first presentation. The fable of Isis and Osiris, as it has descended to us in the account given by Plutarch, has not been greatly amplified by modern research. The Egyptian fragments which have been translated in recent years offer no complete account of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Osiris, nor has any new key been found to unlock this great drama, which may well be termed the Passion Play of Egypt. It's obviously a huge subject, but basically the way most of us know this story is that his brother Set, or Typhon, had ambition to take the throne from Osiris, and then tricked Osiris, killed Osiris, chopped his body into 14 parts and scattered him all over Egypt, all of which were recovered by the goddess and then reassembled all but one, so we have the 13. And that she replaced the missing part with a gold, which was the phallus, which is obviously a fertility symbol, with a golden phallus, which I would tell you corresponds to the golden rays of the sun. Manly P. Hall, in his book Lost Keys of Freemasonry, says early Masonic historians such as Albert Mackey, Robert Frake Gould, and Albert Pike were of a single purpose in their efforts to establish definite correspondences between the Hiramic legend of Freemasonry and the Osirian myth, as expounded in the initiatory rituals of the Egyptians. It is now generally acknowledged that the Egyptians, of all the ancient peoples, were the most learned in the occult sciences of nature. The wisest of philosophies from other nations visited Egypt to be initiated in the sacred mysteries by priests of Thebes, Memphis, and Hermopolis. Thales, Solon, Pythagoras, and Plato journeyed from Greece through the delta of the Nile in quest of knowledge. Upon returning to their own country, these illuminated men acknowledged the Egyptians to be the wisest of mortals, and the Egyptian doctrines concerning the history of the gods and the regeneration of men. So in Freemasonry, basically, originally is 3 degrees: the entered apprentice, the fellowcraft, and then master mason degree, which can also be referred to as entered, passed, and raised. And here on the right, that's supposed to be Hiram Abiff resurrecting from the coffin or the grave. And Manly P. Hall says, Freemasons are the Horai, each was a hawk of the sun. And for one reason is each one raised, and that is to average the destruction of wisdom. Each one is dedicated to the overthrowing of the reign of Typhon, which is the mysterious Armageddon, when the hosts of the adversary shall be routed forever. So Typhon represents the reign of man's ambition, rather than man's purpose being to serve truth and the true spiritual understanding of truth and passing knowledge of truth on to progeny and posterity. So in the 2nd degree, we have this middle chamber. And you can't see into the middle chamber until you go up this spiral staircase. You can't see what's in there. And then the idea is that when you enter this, when you have raised off the floor of the base consciousness, then you're able to enter into this middle chamber, and then in there you're going to find doors. So it's an unseen, mysterious place. And Joseph Campbell says, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. And I would say that would be a reference to this middle chamber. So what we're going to find in that middle chamber are the doors of all possibility. And before that we enter those doors, we have to have the spiritual armor to transmute whatever we find into something that benefits the species. So this middle chamber represents facing the shadow self, going into the darkest places of the soul, and dealing with and facing down whatever we find in there. There's a lot more to say about it, but I'm going to keep moving forward for time's and expedience sake. The Assyrians in their funeral rites, in all respects, imitated the Egyptians and the stellar mythos, and that means the Babylonians or the Sumerians or the Akkadians or whatever you want to call them. These are the northern, and basically during that time, this was all considered to be an extension of northern Egypt, so we have to keep that in mind. The Assyrians in their funeral rites in all respects imitated the Egyptians. In the stellar mythos, we find the Kahuti, or glorious ones, succeeding the elemental powers, with Horus as the 8 and supreme. And these Babylonians converted into evil spirits, not understanding and having forgotten the original, the old Egyptian wisdom. In comparing Egyptian mythology with the Babylonian, the types that represent the evil in the latter had represented good in the former. The elements cannot be immoral or are not immoral. benevolent spirits were transformed into evil entities from mistranslation and deteriorated forms. So I'm claiming all modern doctrines and mythology are by and large derivations of solar doctrine. And at its pinnacle of evolution, which is the cult of Osiris, when the Egyptian eschatology became perfected 50,000 years ago. All modern traditions and mythologies are fashioned out of a detritus of the Egyptian and thus must be studied in Egyptian pure forms, which reveal how it becomes deteriorated and ultimately inert or stagnant in later forms we call religion. And that all traditions are some distortion of this. So when we're studying and we find this ubiquity in modern doctrines, and we can show that ideally it's some deteriorated form of this siren cycle, we're going to arrive at a question: what gives it its persistent vitality? And it's that these fertility rites are vital, because they're the understanding pure fertility rites is the key to unraveling all of our earliest learning and all of our earliest ideas, which are the basis for all the ideas that we have in the modern world, which are largely corrupted forms of this. A lot more to say about that, but I'm going to move forward. Everyone wants to take their prejudice to the truth. Everyone wants to think that their institution is the only institution that hasn't been corrupted or infiltrated by dark occultism. So here I brought along a handful of solar deities, and we can just see that these all have plenty of ubiquities, and they appear to be based on something that they all have this ubiquity. They all have all these similar tenets: 12 disciples, born of a virgin, died on the cross, resurrected. Ideally, I'm going to tell you it all comes from the solar phase of the Egyptian mythos. So let's keep moving forward here. So here's St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. The Vatican at St. Peter's, or this is St. Peter's Square at the Vatican. And I just wanted to point out that Rome had been built on 7 hills, because really what we have over the long period of time, the eons of this time period, what we've had since the rise of the solar cult is a struggle of the solar priests wanting to build their temples on the hallowed ground of the stellar people, and that Rome had originally hallowed stellar ground, and we have these 7 hills signifying that. So that Rome, Cincinnati is the romantic term for the city of 7 hills, and here we can see that the Vatican represents the 8 and then the 7 hills. So this was originally stellar hallowed ground. Now in St. Peter's Square there we have this phallus of Osiris, which was a fertility symbol, but in a corrupted form. And primacy in the north, it became phallic worship. So it's a corrupted form of a more pure ancient Egyptian science. There's a lot more to it, but this corresponds to primacy in the north as well as westing, which is all a correspondence to making our human purpose the pursuit of materialistic ambition versus spiritual purpose. And then the 8-spoked wheel that surrounds the phallus of Osiris, or the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, represents the solstices and the equinoxes of the Zodiac, and then the Sabbats, so that's the 4 cardinal points, and then the Sabbats being the 4 semi-cardinal points. Move forward here. So eschatology is final things perfected in the cult of Osiris 50,000 years ago. Osiris is the first mummy, the first victim, the first resurrection, the Lord of resurrection, the judge of the shades, the god of the underworld. He dies and is born again in 3 forms. So there's some ambiguity there. This is a huge subject. So I brought along some more information that I'm going to be able to cover. So we'll just move forward here and work with what we can. So here, that's Robert Bauval descending into one of the temples that is underground, and I'm trying to tell you that this represents this veneration returning to the night sky following the cult of Amen-Ra. In a sense, we can think of the ritual of Osiris as a coffin ride. It's about dealing with the shadow self and all things unseen that we fear to overcome our fear of death and our fear of darkness. Understanding the shadow self is understanding the nature of the ego to remain executor of the being and want to control things in the extant. And that's how nations and governments behave. When we put man's law on a pedestal, we must overthrow the laws of creation, which is the same as overthrowing the creator itself. So this ritual underground, in a sense, represents the underworld, the tenebrous regions where initiates make contact with the divinities. It is like getting into darkness and finding a way into the afterlife kingdom, the portals of immortality, the portals that led to an afterlife was through death, and therefore the initiates would learn down here in absolute black darkness, perhaps with no torches whatsoever, would come here and imbue the mood of the place and find themselves in a peculiar position of interface. They were that close, they believed, where no one can transit from life, death, and rebirth. The people who came here were early Christians, and yet they were the link between the ancient Egyptian mystery cults and the Gnostic religions. The Gnostic religion, in a sense, is the ancient Egyptian mystery cult Christianized. I agree with that. So we find these underground rites all over the world. As far as Pt2, Eleusis, it's all based on venerating underneath of the temple, because it's a remnant or a deteriorated form of returning to this night sky. So we have this struggle between venerating gods in day sky, which is everything in the modern solar cult, and versus the end of this venerating in the night sky, which was the ritual of Osiris. So the mystery schools that emerged post Akhenaten were about trying to preserve this tradition, because it's very important to understand that the feminine can never be associated with the day sky, and that the day sky typifies physical and the night sky typifies spiritual, which also corresponds to southern hemisphere and northern hemisphere. Southern hemisphere being the spiritual realm, therefore northern the physical realm. So this Osiris, this is what I'm calling the Osiris motif. It should be particularly noted that the Egyptians did not regard Osiris as wholly dead, but view him as continuing to live in the underworld, where he superintends the ceremony of psychostasia. The underworld is not a sphere of the dead alone, it is the world of the mysteries. He is therefore God of the hidden fane, the temple which is beneath the earth, the house of the low ceiling, the crypts in which the initiates go in search of truth. He is the dweller who abides in the darkness of the innermost. His throne is not in the objective world, but in the subjective sphere, which is the inner life of man. This is arcanely intimated that while truth may perish from a society, it cannot die from the heart, which preserves the sacred tradition through the natural inspiration by which all men are gradually moved to truth. So in this story of Osiris, we have this motif. Jealous brother covets the throne and plots to overthrow and murder the, quote, good king. He drives the son, the rightful heir to the throne, into exile, rules with an iron fist, and drives his nation into despotism. The son matures and returns to reclaim the throne and avenge his father's death. Kingdom is restored and health is returned to the land. Good triumphs over evil. So we have this dismemberment, or rememberment from dismemberment is the whole idea of the motif, but to reassemble the mind, it's all about remembering who we are. In order to do that, we have to do the eclectic comparative study and gather all the pieces. And in this motif, we can say that Horus is widow's son. So we can clearly see that this is basically the foundations of what we think of as modern Freemasonry. So I found this same motif in Hamlet. So this is an example of how this has survived and given this persistent vitality to survive in this modern world. So let's take a look at Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. which ultimately is older. It came from Norse Eddas, and it goes clear back. That's my whole point of this presentation. It's that old. The tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, and there's definitely something rotten in Denmark. Let's not kid ourselves. The tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, often shortened to Hamlet, is a tragedy written by William Shakespeare, which is my view controversial, sometime between 1599 and 1602, set in Denmark. The play depicts Prince Hamlet and his revenge against his uncle Claudius, who has murdered Hamlet's father in order to seize the throne and marry Hamlet's mother. So the motif roughly is this: jealous uncle kills king, steals throne and wife, son drives son into exile, son returns from exile, avenges the throne, restoring the kingdom. So where else have we seen this Hamlet motif? Well, how about in the movie The Lion King? The movie The Lion King is analogous with Shakespeare's Hamlet, which is traceable back to the remotest fertility cults. It is nearly a pure form of the Osirian legend. The jealous uncle kills his brother, who is king, and takes his throne, driving the son into exile, who later returns and avenges his throne. The film Apocalypse Now, regarding the Fisher King legend, denotes the ritual of Osiris. So I guess I just wanted to make a mention of that. Probably should take that off that slide. So here we have it in The Lion King. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. Well, where else can we find this motif? I found it in the newest version of King Arthur, The Legend of the Sword. Same motif. Jealous brother kills the king, drives son into exile, kingdom falls into darkness, son returns from exile to kill his uncle, avenges the throne and his father's death. And this is a fascinating film, and I'd like to have more time to fully break this down for you, but I'm not going to have, all the time we would need to fully flesh it out, but let's just take a look at a little bit of it. I guess what we can, before he was able to wield the sword, he had to visit the shadow, or the Darklands, what they called the Darklands, and that to me was an allegory or of him facing and dealing with his shadow self, and being prepared to survive in nature, being able to do the right thing. So we're going to have to deal with that a little bit more. But in the movie, Vortigern is the jealous brother. Uther is Arthur's father who Vortigern murders, drives Arthur into exile. Arthur comes back. He battles Vortigern and reclaims the throne, defeats Vortigern, reclaims the throne. It's all about sovereignty, which is internal sovereignty, internal monarchy, above rulership. And I brought this slide just to say this is, supposed to depict the never-ending war in heaven, which takes place at the highest and lowest places in our psyche. And this is a war that will never end. But see, this is not the same as how evil is manifested into the world. So the idea is that this evil does not exist in the physical world until it's introduced into the world from man. So the key is to bring this into check internally before it manifests externally, and each individual has the responsibility to do that by doing this shadow work. So, the Setian principle is related to getting out of that which refuses to return to source, whereas the Horus principle, that which returns to source. And the Jungian quote comes to mind: the man will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing his own soul. And I found this to be interesting, this round table in this King Arthur, because, see, this is a representation of the Zodiac. And I'm saying that this part of this table that's under construction, interestingly enough, represents the descent into the southern hemisphere when we're in the north. And that typifies the shadow realm. This is the shadow realm. This is where the work needs to be done. So this part of this table, or this eschatology, is under construction because we lost the perfected eschatology. So this is under construction. And that the way, the light is at the center of darkness. So we need to reach the bottommost point there. The depth to which we understand evil is equal to the height which we understand good. So ideally, we would be going in the astro-theological allegory from spring equinox, which would be left center of this table, to the top of the table there, which would represent solar solstice. That's the raising. But the way to raise is through the darkness. So we have to do the shadow work and understand the dark aspect in order to raise, to get to the fully raised, enlightened aspect. And these are just some slides I made to show how this journey takes place. And then here I'm just going to show you the correspondence with the Zodiac. So I found that interesting, this rendition of this round table in this movie. There's a lot more to it. One more thing I want to say about this movie is that the sword in this movie represents truth itself. It can also correspond to the penetrative rays of the sun. It's a masculine force, but the main thing to understand is it typifies truth. Also, one more thing is that Knights, knights, corresponds to night sky. Nights. So Arthur defeats Vortigern, returns to the throne. And then, I'm not going to fully break this down, but this is not about man as a sovereign ruler of his kingdom, his external kingdom. This is about man as internal monarchy, ruler of his internal kingdom, and being on equal footing with his peers or his constituency or mankind. So it's, there's a lot to it, but I'm going to keep moving forward because we don't have a lot of time. And I'm just going to show you a few other examples here where we find this Osirian motif. In the quick and the dead, the motif, the Redeemer promised to come again and at the end of time to judge the quick and the dead. Well, I would relate the quick to Mercury or Thoth, which is the quicksilver. It's the closest planet to the sun, so it makes the fastest trek around the sun. And I'm not going to break this fully down, but Ellen, E-L, and then L-E-N. L is God, and then L-E-N is Lune. So she represents goddess, the lunar principle. And then Court is the protagonist. The kid is alleged to be the son of Herod. He Rod, or her odd. It's he Rod, but it's a masculine force. And I could break this down a lot better. I'm just not going to do it right now because we don't have time. But here's another film that typifies ritual of Osiris. The idea that the lost part was the phallus and this phallic worship and these golden rays of the sun. We have this gold member. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I would say that some of this is based on the perversions and the cultural memes of Freudian psychology that I talked about. It's all based in hubris and corrupted forms of the Osirian myth, which led to phallic worship and what have you. One other thing about this film is Dr. Evil, who I didn't include in the slide, I probably should have. Basically, Mini-Me represents, has a satanic ideology, and that Mini-Me represents basically the world population. The idea, the Carlos Castaneda quote, all the sorcerer has to do is give you his mindset, which is dual consciousness. So Mini-Me kind of represents the Mini-Me version of Dr. Evil, which is the sorcerer giving you his mindset, Mini-Me Satanism, we can call it. And then in this film, What About Bob? We have this death therapy which cures him. And then he writes a book about it and it becomes a bestseller. And then Leo's jealous. But It's an interesting film, but it deals with the death motif, and it's definitely, I would tell you, it is the ritual of Osiris, the idea of this coffin ride. There's a lot more I could say about this, but we're moving fast, so we're going to keep going. And as I said, this is the most influential work in my research. And in this book, From Ritual to Romance by Jesse L. Weston, we find this Fisher King legend. So let's go ahead and read this slide. The Fisher King legends imply that he becomes unable to father or support a next generation to carry on after his death. A thigh wound has been interpreted by many scholars in Arthurian literature as a genital wound. So it's dealing with fertility. And I'm telling you, ultimately, it's the ritual of Osiris. This Fisher King legend comes out of the ritual of Osiris. But we have this fish symbolism and this chalice, which represents a romance, the Christian romances, or the assimilation of culture, with Rome assimilating culture, injecting these religious artifacts to bolster their doctrines. But to quote from the book, there's little reason to doubt that if we regard the fish as divine life symbol of immemorial antiquity, we shall not go very far astray from truth, is what she means. So understanding the fish symbolism is a big part of understanding the Osirian myth. I'm not going to fully explain it now, so we're just going to keep moving forward. You got to go fast. Now, this was a tradition that was in Europe, around the time following Charlemagne, between the 8th and 10th century, or the 9th and 11th century. And this is an interesting tradition based on Roland, who was one of Charlemagne's key generals. It is important to consider that the Albigensians endeavored to spiritualize chivalry with conventions such as the Song of Roland. The Arthurian legend became more popular because the Arthurian legend offered something not found in the Song of Roland, a feminine principle, a romance, which made it of greater appeal to the masses, something for everyone, so to speak. But this is actually a film, and it's a good film, and I would check it out. I would study this subject because it's part of understanding the Arthurian cycle. And here's another King Arthur movie, and I brought this one along just to point out that this is a modern film that's been made to try to bolster the idea that King Arthur was actually a historical character. I'm sure we've heard that before. So it has similarities to the idea of the historical Christ, if you will. So what are these Vulgate cycles? The idea of the Vulgate cycles is that pre-Vulgate implies before the story becomes romanced and then introduced into literary form. So prior to that, it's an oral tradition, and that during the Vulgate cycle, it's starting to become romanced and stylized, and then we have new characters, and then the stories start to revolve more around the Knights of the Round Table and these Christian motifs that are being injected into this Celtic legend. I just want to say one more thing is we have these Christian motifs introduced into this Arthurian cycle because Rome assimilates culture. And, the whole point about this tradition is that if it hadn't been for the Arthurian tradition and the Norse traditions, which were the strong cultures that resisted the imposing Latin Christendom, this knowledge in these mystery schools would not have survived into the modern world. That's a big point that I'm trying to make. But that this character Lancelot didn't exist in the pre-Vulgate cycle, and that he was introduced, and then this romance with Guinevere, was part of assimilating this tradition, and then bolstering this idea of this Holy Grail, and then making this whole round table about seeking this religious artifact that bolsters the Christian claims to the historical Jesus and the doctrines that ensued. This Roman Church. A lot more to it, but we're going to move forward. So when we study ritual to romance, we're immediately going to discover Sir James George Frazer, who basically wrote this encyclopedia of culture. It's probably 13 volumes, and It's just a massive archive of world culture. One thing I'm trying to say about this is anthropology, and when we get into the anthropology, it's an eclectic study. So we're going to realize by the magnitude of Fraser's work that it's a huge endeavor, and not to be discouraged or swayed away from the task at hand. It is possible that we can deal with this, and there's abridged versions. I haven't read. I work with the abridged version, okay? And it's not a book that you read; it's a book that you learn to work with and reference. And I brought along this picture of Turner's Golden Bough. So this is a painting. In the opening of the Golden Bough, Fraser says, "Who does not know Turner's picture of the Golden Bough? The scene is suffused with the golden glow of imagination in which the divine mind of Turner, steeped and transfigured even the fairest natural landscape, is a dreamlike vision of the little woodland at Lake Nemi, Diana's Mirror, as it was called by the ancients. No one who has seen that calm water lapped in the green hollow of the Alban Hills of Italy can ever forget it." So the one thing I want to say is that we have to understand that the work that in the eclectic encyclopedia of culture that Fraser has provided with is not exactly the same as his conclusions about it. It's similar to Darwin. We have Darwin's findings, and then we have Darwin's conclusion. Those things the same with Fraser. They have to be discerned from each other and dealt with separately. So, for instance, the work, The Golden Bough, is an invaluable resource for an eclectic study of culture. However, Fraser's conclusions about what he found, I would take umbrage with. Ideally, Fraser's conclusions are that the traditions that he finds are local to where they're found. They're localized. And my conclusion on it is that they all had come from Egypt and imported to where they're found, unless they're found in Egypt. So we're going to keep moving forward here. So in the Greek mythology and the Roman mythology, we have Persephone and Proserpina. Proserpina basically being the Greek or the Roman variant of the Greek Persephone. And Persephone goes into the underworld to visit her father's shade. Main thing is, I'm going to tell you, study Edith Hamilton, but this is Ritual of Osiris in a corrupted, deteriorated form. But it's important because this is part of how it was preserved into the modern world. So here we're going to talk about Royal Arch Masonry. So this arch here represents this upper half of this solar cycle in the northern hemisphere. So this came from, I would tell you, the cult of Amen-Ra. Of course, it was lost and then resurrected, sometime, post Babylon. But that it's a corruption, or it led to a corruption in the solar mythology because it put everything primacy in day sky. So here's some words that we get from this day sky conundrum. Deity, deist, piety, pious, the word theist, opus dei, God's work, regarding day sky. A fertile season corresponds to the summer season, spring-summer season. The propensities of venerating day sky solar aspects or deities is what we're trying to deal with. It corresponds to Icarus flying too close to the sun. So left brain imbalance, solar pillar. But this archway is the holy mountain. So let's go ahead and mention that. It's a solar aspect. The arch is a solar aspect. Corresponds to day sky in the summer season in the north. It's physical, polarized in that sense. And primacy in the north, we're not going to be able to understand until I explain it a little bit better, but also westing. So the idea of chasing the lure of gold and the alchemical allegory into the west. It's materialism. It's about chasing or being in pursuit of ambition or materialism. We're going to talk a little bit about ram symbolism, and you see I have more Royal Arch Masonry because it corresponds in the acronym. And the Royal Archmasonry came out of the York Rite, which was different than the Scottish Rite, but these both seem to have merged in Western Europe and ideally in Britain or in England. So, but yeah, the ram is one of the most important symbols that we'll ever learn to understand, and it's not really an exhaustible symbol, but we need to understand its general principle, which corresponds to Aries, which is the 322 spring equinox in the north. But the ram was also venerated because it could go high up on the mountainsides and seemingly cling to the cliff sides. And that represents raised in consciousness, the mountain of consciousness, the holy mountain, but it also can represent the fallopian tubes, which is a feminine fertility cycle. It represents a masculine principle in the sense that it can charge, it's charging up the hill. I suppose the curving of the horns are part of the symbolism, and then I brought a couple subversive uses of it with the ram symbolism, the ram on the vehicle, and then McDonald's, the Royal Archways. When there we have an archway, that's also interesting. So we have a ram and an arch together in this subversive form. One other thing to mention here is that understand that the ancients, they venerated the dawn with equal reverence with the sun itself. So the reason for that is because it's about the split between the day and the night. It's the where the physical realm meets the spiritual realm. And there's a lot more to that, but I'm going to keep moving forward. So as I said, this westing is this phenomenon of going into materialism. It corresponds. So the idea that the wild, wild west, the rugged individualism of the Western American culture in the early times, it corresponds to this chasing this allure of the sun into the west. It's no irony. And there's two films here, Westworld, where basically he ends up in a world of cyborg control and cyborgs, and it's a fascinating film. And then they've remade this, and it's even more disturbing now. But I'm telling you, this is no irony. This is, whether they understand or not, this corresponds to this pursuing man's ambition and chasing the allure of the sun, which constitutes materialism or utilitarianism, this Roman pragmatism. And then another film, Mulholland Drive, when he steps out of line as a director, he has a hard time coming to terms with the fact that he's owned. So he has to go see the cowboy, and this corresponds to this phenomenon of westing. Now, this is going to be a little bit more difficult of a slide here, but this primacy in the north is dealing with the earlier phase of the Egyptian mythos when they came out of the south into the north. So going into the north is the same in the stellar phase as going into the west in the solar phase. And in the first picture on the left, we have Horus, the god of the north, deposing Sut. S-U-T is south, the god of South Pole and the original primary deity. In the solar phase, it's Horus in the solar cult battles Set or Sut in the daily and yearly struggle for power. The solar cult deals with constellations west to east, east to west. So one of the big contentions that I'm going to make in this presentation is that this image on the right, which is partially anthropomorphized, obviously came from solar phase because nothing before the solar phase was anthropomorphized. It's a contingency that was formed in the stellar cult in the form of double acts. And that was the earliest of the secret societies because that was the first contingency to deal with taking the mythos from the southern hemisphere and then moving it into the north. So this was Horus of the double horizon. So this would be the first contingency, and therefore they would have sent out caravans. This would have constituted the earliest secret society. And I know that's advanced, but for the advanced student, we can deal with this. And we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to understand it. I'm not going to fully explain it now, but I'm saying it, that this was the first secret society because this was the first contingency, and that they would have sent caravans out, and that Horus of the double horizon, Horus Behutet, is the contingency for primacy in the north, therefore ideally the contingency for westing and ending up in a world of materialism and man's ambition dominated by man's law instead of the spiritual laws of creation, the moral laws that exist here in nature that govern the dynamics of human behavior. As morality declines, freedom declines. So the farther we stray from truth, the farther we fall from perfection as a species. The more we uphold man's law, the more we're overthrowing the creator. That's the loss of the soul. That's the loss of freedom. That's the loss of all that is good and decent, and then ultimately the stagnation and then extinction of man. And that's the other thing I want to say about the judgment of Osiris is it represents not just the individual soul, it represents an extinction event or the potential for this extinction event. So alchemy basically is, it's an extension of the mystery school, but it's dealing with the fact that everything being spiritualized, and then we're entering into a phase of more advanced technology. So now metallurgy is being spiritualized. And alchemy literally means from chem, because chem is the ancient name for Egypt, or out of darkness, the Black Land. And I associated alchemy largely with Neoplatonism, but alchemy literally means from chem, or out of the darkness, and it's an occult tradition taught through allegories. An allegory is a cryptic story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted or decoded in order to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral lesson. In the tradition of alchemy, it is asserted that all have modes of human consciousness. Base metals are imperfections of pure consciousness, gold, and that all metals are ordained by nature to become perfect, the gold of the sun, enlightened. The alchemist seeks to remove all of his or her thoughts, emotions, and actions that are their disorderly imperfections or base characteristics in order to bring them to their true state of natural order, harmony with natural law, and to transmute them into alchemical gold, representing the purification of body, mind, and spirit. So this idea of out of the Black Land is dealing with how the Nile would overflow its banks and replenish the soil with the fluvian soils and refertilize the land for planting. And that all of Egypt's wealth had been based on agriculture. So let's keep that in mind. And then I put the Hermetic principles on there basically because they're far more ancient. Ideally they're the basis of all of it. But see, these were lost and then rediscovered in Neoplatonism. So they're basically associated with Hermeticism or Neoplatonism. So keep in mind that Hermes is basically the Greek variant of the Egyptian Thoth, which is far, far older. So here's a film or a story by Rudyard Kipling that deals with this alchemical allegory. The man who would be king, and the whole motif is they came for the gold but stayed for the adventure. Now this is a very, very popular motif. It's an alchemical allegory referring to the golden ray or gold of the sun, which is a symbol of enlightenment. So the idea is that they attained the enlightenment, and then in a corrupted form, they stayed for the adventure. They used the enlightenment to be worshipped as gods and reign over a kingdom. And then in the pure form or the benevolent form, it's that they came they attained the gold and then educated their people and raised everybody up so everybody can understand this. But here's a few examples where we find this ritual of Osiris in this alchemical phase. The Man Who Would Be King by Rudyard Kipling, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is a film, or the book by Conrad, and then the film Apocalypse Now Aguirre, the Wrath of God, Fitzcarraldo, the story of Enlil and Achian, the Sumerian account, and Alexander the Great, which is a historical account. So this is. I'm telling you, this is the persistent vitality of how this Osirian legend survived into the modern world, and it's all based on this idea of this hero myth. Now, this was a slide I found online to try to help explain this, but this isn't detailed exactly like I would detail it, but I'm going to use this to try to make better diagrams. But it basically gives us the idea of how this solar cycle is mythologically represented in this hero myth. Or this hero myth is mythologically represented in the astro-theological journey of the sun through the zodiac. So here I've contrasted it with the zodiac so we can get a better look at this. And the hero myth and the astro-theology. So don't ever confuse astro-theology with astrology, because astrology is divining and it's a complete corrupted form of fortune telling, as though someone can know the future. You can know natural law and the trajectory, but you can never know what tomorrow brings or what the future holds. So astrology is I would call a Christian convention or a solar cult convention to marginalize astro-theology and further conceal the esoteric meaning of this hero myth in the solar phase. And the sun dies on the cross during the winter solstice in the lowest point in the northern hemisphere, and then it comes back into the north after Easter and makes its way back to the high point of power at the summer solstice. So it's all about the claim to the Most High. But here we have Jesus depicted on the cross at the winter solstice, representing the dying on the cross. The Son of God dying on the cross at the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere. So orientation is key. We have to be able to orientate ourselves geographically and understand this astronomically in regard to this particular cosmic movement of the sun. So we have Osiris at the winter solstice, Horus at the spring equinox, Ra fully raised most high in the solar doctrine, and then Set taking us back down into the underworld. So this point between Set and Osiris is where the struggle occurs with Typhon or Set, which is where we get the word typhoon. It's obviously a destructive power. There's a lot more to it. I'm not going to fully explain it now. And there's a lot of these slides, so I'm just going to try to move through them as quickly as I can. But yeah, we've described this birth, growth, decay, the 322, the ram, the dismemberment, rememberment through the eternal womb, and then in the north, and how things had ultimately been put into the north in the stellar phase, and why that led into materialism and the corruption in the solar phase. There's a lot more to it, but we're going to keep moving fast. And this is just another, this one has the birth, growth, decay on it, so we can understand that represents the mortal life, that upper part of this cycle. So the under part, that represents the journey of the soul or the mains through the netherworld or the underworld. So ideally, we're going to talk about how this corresponds also to our modern day mechanical clock and how this is part of this corruption in this ancient sacred science. So in military time, we have the 12, which is typifying the solar doctrine and the greater mysteries at the point of Osiris, which I would tell you would be correct. However, this is a difficult slide to explain, but here we have the military civilian time and how it corresponds to our modern mechanical clock as we know it. I'm just going to have to move through this. I'm not going to be able to fully break this down, but we'll take a look at a few more slides, try to get an idea of what I'm getting at here. But we just have the opportunity to look at what military time looks like on a clock with the 0, which represents a 24 at the top, and the 12, which represents the greater mysteries and the divisions of the Zodiac, etc., all things 12 at the bottom. This is a solar phenomenon. So the lesser mysteries were in the 7, and then the greater mysteries were in the 10, ultimately became the 12. So these are just advanced statements that I'm going to include here. We're going to have to do our own diligence to fully flesh this out, but now they've been introduced, we know what our work is to do. So it's all about the claim to the Most High, and understanding that that which is truly the Most High is the laws of creation, and the Creator that created those laws in creation. But it's all about the claim to the Most High, and I wanted to show here how the sun rising corresponded to the east, and the sun setting corresponded to the west, and that this is how I would want my clock on the wall to look, because this would be like looking at the clock from a northern perspective, north to south. So we're looking south, then we have the sun rising in the east. So getting oriented is key. And then I wanted to show you that the day sky mythology happens from 6 a.m. to 12 noon, and then the eschatology would be 6 p.m. to 12 midnight. That's where the struggle between Set and Osiris would take place, or Set and Horus, or Typhon and Osiris, however we want to break it down. But this is how the mingling of the mythology and the perfected eschatology actually had happened. So it has to do with this. I'm not going to fully explain it, but I'm just giving you enough so we can get it on the table. We need many hands make light work. At least we've got it on the table now. We can work with this material, because we're not getting out of this slavery until we deal with this. This is what it's all about. So here we can see what it would look like in the military time. Just keep moving forward. So, this error in time is about when Gregory the 13th introduced and forced all indigenous cultures onto the mechanical clock in the 16th century, 1585. And how that basically constituted a complete shift in world population, to where we had more than 50% of the world shifting into materialism. And how this Protestant Reformation and this Council of Trent had been part of that. And let me just say here, the word Pope means Papa. So this primacy in the north, or this letter P, typifies single axe, which typifies primacy in the north, because as I had said, double axe was the original contingency, Horus of the double horizon. So single axe, which represents a letter T, and then single axe represents a letter P, corresponds to a fully masculine principle, primacy in the north. So Pope is Papa. So a papal bull represents the charging bull. So it's a fatherly charge. Let's keep that in mind. But yeah, in 1585, Gregory the 13th signed a papal bull, a fatherly charge, and forced all indigenous peoples onto the mechanical clock in the Gregorian calendar. And there's a lot more to it. And I'll give you a little bit more of it, but just trying to keep moving forward here. But yeah, see here, I'm trying to show that how when we went, we came from the cult of Amen-Ra into the cult of Osiris. That means we made Osiris most high. So now we have this rivalry between the original solar deity Amen-Ra as most high, and then Osiris, battling for supremacy. You have to understand, these are anthropomorphized, personified, humanized elemental powers. These exist in nature in anthropomorphized form. They're romanced and then historicized and literalized, and then mistaken for divine revelation. So this is part of the issue that we're dealing with in the world today. So in its pure form, this Osiris cycle on the left here represents providence and the protective care of God or nature as a spiritual power. So this is overthrown when we establish man's law. This corresponds to the left brain imbalance, the westing, the primacy in the north, physical ambition, which gives us Roman pragmatism. So without the divine providence, man sets up as the lawmaker, and we enter into a corporate world, which we can call the land of the dead. So we literally can call that upset. That's where the term comes from. That's zombie land. The dead are up walking around, completely unconscious people. They're dead in their thoughts and their emotions and their actions. So we have a world of proxy, which the Egyptians understood could never be afforded by man if he was going to ensure his own survival. So it's no irony that this is the case. This is why we call it zombie land. At the soul level, we understand this. But that this is part of the phenomenon, this mingling of the mythology, which represented the purpose of the hero to raise corrupted, but the raising was the journey into the darkness. But the corruption is when we anthropomorphized it and put man on a pedestal as the lawmaker. This is how it happened. So this is going to have to be restored into pure forms of this doctrine to deal with the epistemological cultural differences. You have to deal with cultural epistemology, and this is the only way to show that they all have common origin and that their languages have common origin, and the only differences in it are that they spread out in different geographic localities and then stagnated, because the evolution only continued to occur in Egypt. But post Osiris, that represents a downgrade. So everything after Osiris represented a downgrade. So Christianity is the pinnacle of the solar doctrine. So ultimately, it's the pinnacle of the entire evolution of the Egyptian mythos. But it's a deterioration of it because it's anthropomorphized, historicized, and then the sacred texts are literalized instead of understanding in their allegorical, esoteric teaching. Keep moving fast here. I'll just point out here that, the names in the calendar: January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. That there's an older calendar that represents a deca system here, because sept is 7 and oct is 8, nov is 9, and deca is 10, corresponding to December. So for instance, 9/11 we could say is actually 7/11 in the older calendar, which I found very interesting. And obviously July corresponds to Julius Caesar, and then August corresponding to Augustus. So obviously this is a Roman convention, but this is not necessarily the Julian calendar that we're talking about, but it's certainly not the Gregorian calendar that we know today. Let's just keep moving forward. So it's all corruption of fertility rites, and that's about how magic became fetishism. How the desire to guide, to pass our goodwill, to assist the journey of our ancestors' soul going through the underworld, and then creating artifacts and tokens to leave with them, like the Ankh, and then worshiping the Ankh itself. That became fetishism. Then we coveted the material instead of having the wish for the soul to have a safe journey through the underworld. It's all about a corruption of fertility rites. So the only way to do that is to restore fertility rites into pure forms if we're going to deal. All the dogma in the world is post Osiris. So if we can resurrect, or if we can restore this Osirian legend and understand the fertility rites and the pinnacle of the solar cult, we can deal with most of the dogma in the world, but the rest of it is lunar and stellar, and that's more obscured. And really, to understand fully the Osirian legend, we do need to understand what came before. So ideally, we're going to have to deal with all of it, but I would tell you that everything's post-Osiris, which means if we dealt with the Osirian cycle, we would be able to dispel most of the dogma in the world. So it's this day sky, night sky rivalry, this king of the hill and the holy mountain, and that it was perfected, 50 to 60,000 years ago, and then corrupted after, since 40,000 years ago when we went into the eschatology cult. That's where we get the mummification and all these perversions and all these strange traditions came out of not understanding this Egyptian science. And it gets stigmatized, basically cast in view as superstition, and then it's stigmatized, marginalized, and then ultimately, associated with evil, and everything is inverted or perverted and corrupted. So we're not getting out of this without dealing with this. So we have Osiris raised to most high. This disorientation causes the mingling of the mythology and the eschatology. It is paramount to understand why the spiritual realm is associated with night sky, and at the same time understand how darkness invokes fear. Ignorance is the only darkness that needs to be feared. The square on the seat of Osiris is the most profound aspect because that's man's perfection of the physical realm. A lot more to that. The doctrine of incarnation, reincarnation, and the resurrection brought on from the stellar was established in the solar cult under the phase of fatherhood. The Horus of the double equinox, Horus the child in one equinox, who was Horus the adult in the other, constituted the double Hermanicus, one of the Trifiller, one as Horus of the incarnation, the other of Horus of the resurrection. The doctrine was first depicted as solar mythologically and next eschatologically. The difficulty has been to place the various portrayals of evolution in the correct order, and this has been caused by the latest phase, the Osirian, having been given the most prominent place in the ritual, which has obscured the former imagery, as these have been brought on and mixed with the latest developments. Amenta, in one aspect, became the world of the dead, the Kasu, or burial place in the Osirian cult, which followed the cult of Amen. In the latest imagery, Osiris became the god of Amenta, or the god of the dead, or underworld, or heaven of eternity, where the sun and the mains went down in the west to pass through and emerge to rise again on the Mount of Glory in the east. By many writers, Osiris has been considered to have been a human living man, but he was, in fact, only the last imagery of the solar cult before the phase of eschatology. So this is all astro-theology, and now I'm going to show you how this plays out in the Christian cycle, in the resurrection of Jesus. It's the same thing. Most important to understand, an important point about the sun's journey through the different houses of Zodiac, where it exists in each house successfully, is that the transfer from one house to the next involves a power struggle and then results in an absolute transfer of power. The power struggle and power transfer has been the substance of myth and legend from time immemorial. The most great stories and legends deal with this particular phenomenon, and its potency is derived from the fact that it is about fertility and infertility, meaning incarnation and reincarnation of a fertility cycle, or in the divine aspect, the journey of an everlasting human soul, or, as I said, an extinction event. So there's a lot more to all this. I'm not going to fully explain it. There's no way we would have time, but I'm just putting it here so we have this, and then I'm going to be continuing to extrapolate on this. This is what my work consists of. So here I'm just showing you the cycles and the sine wave of the cycles and the journey through the zodiac. The Egyptian mythos was not venerated in constellations west to east or east to west until the onset of lunar and ultimately the solar phase of the evolution of the mythos. Waxing and waning angles are determined by geographic perspectives, but typically with regard to primacy in the northern hemisphere. These are ancient methods or the ancient science of timekeeping and is spiritualized in the hero myth and ultimately the eschatology, which deals with the waning angles, decreasing power. Thus, this is the early astronomy and cosmology of understanding pure forms of mythology, is understanding how these are spiritualized in the expression of understanding elemental powers, which is the sacred science. And this is just the same thing, showing you how the solar doctrine or the solar phase is affected by the movement from the northern to the southern hemisphere, and that this number 47 is very significant because it represents the 23.5 degrees to the Tropic of Capricorn in the south from the equator, and then 23.5 degrees from from the equator to the Tropic of Cancer in the northern hemisphere. And it's all astro-theology, but the esoteric meaning and the teaching of the spiritual is in the mythological expression. How to become fully raised, how to learn this sacred science. That's the esoteric part. And I have a note here that Venus and Moon are feminine aspects. So let's always keep that in mind, because she's the birther of the hero. Isis is the birther of the hero, the Egyptian goddess. There's a lot to that. I'm not going to fully get into that. We are not here to be fixed by the church. We are here to fix the church, or temple, if you will, what is happening between our ears. So this Temple of Solomon is the symbolic temple we find in the first degree board of Freemasonry, representing the left brain, right brain hemispheres, with the left brain corresponding to intellectualism, or the intellect, and then the right brain, feminine intuitive qualities, masculine left brain, feminine right brain. A lot more to that, sun and moon, but we're going to move on. So when these are divided and split, we get this phenomenon known as polarization dialectics, which is basically how the world is controlled today, how this social engineering is affected or effective. And then we end up with these religions all ready to defend their, monotheistic God. And it's a dialectical manipulation, it's all represent an imbalance. And we get these elephant cults and these donkey cults and this politics, which is a world of man's law and proxy, and this illusion that government was ever, a secular idea. It's still non-secular. It's always has been. And, the world is ruled by religion. We have to understand that. So here I'm showing you how the phases of the evolution of the mythos correspond to these pillars. And I'm showing you how this was codified in the pyramids, which proves that the stellar people who built the pyramids understood this. And the word Israel represents each phase of the evolution of the mythos, with the is the lunar phase, the Ra is the solar phase, and the El is the stellar phase. And that the term Jew, it's not an ethnicity, it's a religio ethnicity. So parochialism is about, the idea that they're God's chosen people. So it's not really any different than the master race. It's just, it's a claim to the Most High. It's all about the claim to the Most High. There's a lot more to it. I'm not going to fully explain it now, but, here's what this solar cult looks like in the modern world, To even think that resources are used, but, I don't really have a problem with it, because there is an esoteric, allegorical, positive teaching in the Christian, if it's properly understood. But this idea that we're supposed to externalize our faith that this Savior might come back and save everybody, it's bunk. So it's the individual's responsibility to become like Christ, to fully raise. But this one in the lower right, this ark that is built in Kentucky, I do have a problem with that, because all of these solar doctrines are based on this idea of this flood. And this, the idea that the world was saved on a boat full of animals. And this is a myth that needs to be put to bed. And the fact that it doesn't even think that this was paid for with tax dollars it's an atrocity. But, these are symbols, in this sense, in my view, of slavery, because they're reinforcing this solar slavery in this solar phase of the solar doctrine. Abraham doctrines are reinforced by the idea of this flood, and this flood, antediluvian, it implies the pre-flood, which means there was this flood. What we have is a great year cycle, and that this glacial epoch happens at the end of this cosmic cycle, this great year cycle. So in this cosmic cycle, we have a cosmic summer and we have a cosmic winter, and the last ice age is the last cosmic winter in this great year, 26,000 year cycle. So the deluge is the recommencement and the commencement of the cycle, recommencement of the cycle. Advanced in the sense of understanding that true spirituality means being out of the axioms of man's authority and seeing order following as any kind of a virtue, as well as being out of the axioms of money and religion, which is what the belief in money and government are, because religions constitute an arrestment in development and hold us back in consciousness and growth as a species. Albert Churchward. Mythology or mythological forms of religion are not represented quite as thoughts only, but are types used as to express certain original powers that are inherent, physical as well as spiritual. The followers of the Romantic school, who hold mythology to have been magic out of some general undefined feeling or popular conviction, can only be taken as trying to read before learning the alphabet. Their deductions can only be assumed as fabulous romances because they have never learned to sign language or touched the bottom of the subject matter. There is assuredly nothing more unscientific or unhistorical than to deny the law of development and the religious idea as a whole. There's a natural order to the development of these ideas, this recondite knowledge that we're talking about. So I'm telling you that this is the lost symbol. The solar people used this in two forms. First, as the hammer or axe, the proof being that the Ptah at Memphis was called the great chief of the hammer or the great chief of the axe, and was symbolically represented as such in one form. In the earlier cult, Horus was the great chief of the hammer, cleaver of the way, as Horus of the double horizon. So the letter P corresponds to single axe, which means primacy in the north. The letter T corresponds to double axe, which is like I told you, the first contingency for secret society. The first secret society is a contingency for going primacy in the north. And pata or ta represents both of these forms, and ah, which is the vowel sound, which is spiritualized. And this letter P, as an example, in president, P is chief, and then resident, so we have chief resident. And the 7 is an analog of single axe. So we have to keep that in mind. There's a lot to this. But that if it's not understood, we have to understand this, and this is the Nicaea, So when we're talking about Nicaea, this is its purest form. And the whole point about this is, these forms and these symbols are the origins of all modern religious symbolism. That's why this is so important, because this is the pure forms of the symbolism. And here's gavel today, and it represents power. So I don't know if anybody's seen the movie Agora, but it's a fascinating film, and it's based on the true story of Hypatia. Basically represents, the early, first and second century, the early Christianity, which, as I said, was the waning of the Serapis god, and then the rise of the Roman Empire, which ultimately became the rise of the Holy Roman Empire following Nicaea. Hypatia is endeavoring to teach the Gnostic version of the Christianity, but that this movie had been buried. And another reason I wanted to show you, because I found that pure form of the gavel in this film, which I thought was very interesting. So this phenomenon of hafting is this, when we had gavel, it was transferred into this when our implementation began to evolve. And then here I'm showing double axis Horus Behutet, the first contingency of Horus of the double horizon, and how that became primacy in the north. There's a lot more to this. I'm not going to fully explain it now. Etymologically, root of the word natural, it comes from nater. The English word nature is etymologically derived from the Egyptian word mtr, meaning God, because only the whole point is the vowels were omitted, so only the consonants are used here, meaning God, symbolized our physical interpretation of the spiritual deity, meaning God symbolized hieroglyphically as a symbolized stylized axe or flagpole representing power or force in nature. So let's just keep moving forward because we're almost through this. And then here's single axe today. Here's what it looks like in modern corrupted forms. And here I'm showing some of the Akkadian and Sumerian gods, showing this upper half of this gavel and how that corresponds to single axe, and that the double axe had been a contingency. So here in the Americas, we have these TPs, which are spires, and TP typifies double axe followed by single axe, and venerates the spire ritual, which is typified by the Great Pyramids of Giza. Native American peoples are clearly stellar cult people, pyramid builders originally. Well, they were mound builders when they came here, because they came here before they were building the pyramids. So I say they migrated here about 250,000 years ago during the stellar cult, and that's about 100,000 years before they developed their technology enough to build the pyramids. But it's a spire ritual, the spiritual. Great Pyramid of Giza, the grandest and greatest religious temple ever built. Much has been written on the Great Pyramid by various authors and scientific men as the most perfect temple that ever has been built or ever will be built. It was built to teach the 7 astro-stellar cult mysteries in symbolism and applied eschatology. Also to record and register time and measurement. The name Great Pyramid was the Kahuti, who denotes the 7 lights or 7 glorious ones. It also signifies the Heru-Karuti, or the light, a symbolic representation of stone of Horus of the light of the world in all his doctrines. Whatsoever the 7 Kahuti were as individual stars, they were also later in the solar cult configured as a group in Ursa Minor called the followers of the coffin of Osiris, which was imaged in the Great Bear, which is Ursa Minor, not the Big Dipper. I'm not going to get into that. So the spire ritual is a ritual. A ritual is a sequence of activities involving gestures, words, and objects performed in a sequestered place and according to a sequence. A spire is a conical or pyramidal structure on the top of a building, often a skyscraper or church tower, similar to a steeped tented roof. Etymologically, the word is derived from the Old English meaning sprout, shoot, or stalk of grass, from Latin spiraculum or spirare, breath, to breathe. So it has to do, the breath was the life force. So when we see, like when somebody would die and we'd see the steam rising off the cooling corpse, that was associated with the breath or the life force leaving the body. This idea of rising up to heaven comes from that. Rituals may be prescribed by the traditions of a community, including religious communities. Even common actions like handshaking may be said to be rituals. So here I've got information on circled dot, how that's the source of our symbolism for all-seeing eye. I'm not going to fully read this, but it's there for us when we want to access it. We're going to have to learn about this spiral ritual and this eye on the mount and this all-seeing eye symbolism. So that's part of the purpose of today's presentation, is to show these origins of all our most powerful symbolism that's corrupted and not understood in the modern world. And I'm showing you here, this is what we ultimately have to understand, that psychology is the top of the hierarchy of science. And until we understand this, it's hubris. Until we're ready to face this fact, it's hubris. It's man's ambition to put another Lexus in the driveway and get the tenure for his career, to further his career. It has nothing to do with truth discovery. Psychology is the hierarchy of science. Psychology is the top of the pyramid of the hierarchy of sciences. Of course, these lower floors are advanced today. Now we have fractal mathematics, quantum physics, and electrochemistry. But the top 2 floors are behind the curve, and they haven't caught up yet. But see, in the ancient world, this was fully understood. And this is what the pyramids were built to tell us, partly. Psychological or spiritual aspect of things are the realm of consciousness, understanding that the science of causality, puts us closer to source. So that's what this whole stigma is about, is we don't understand the science of causality. And that's what the Egyptian advanced knowledge is understanding this high psychology. Consciousness is the ability of being to recognize patterns and meaning with respect to events taking place both within oneself and within the realm in which the self exists and operates. Nikola Tesla says that science is but a perversion of itself unless it has as its ultimate goal the betterment of humanity. Manly P. Hall says, today tyranny looms large. The rights of man have been undermined in numerous areas. Most of all, materialism is rampant among groups on the ground that it is only but the extinction of ideas that slavery can be perpetuated. Materialism leads inevitably towards the acceptance of slavery. It removes from the individual his vision of greater spiritual value and in this way takes away from him his basic impulses to defend and protect such value at all costs. These are some vital sources for understanding our material today. Gerald Massey's The Book of the Dead. Manly P. Hall's The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, which includes two very important other books, and Albert Churchward's Signs and Symbols. Albert Churchward says a great error is often committed on account of the disguise and false colors in which many things appear when presented to us in an imperfect state. I have seen thousands of things which are not in reality what they appear to be, and that both in the moral and natural world, knavery puts on the face of justice, hypocrisy and superstition wear the visage of piety, and deceit and evil are often clothed in the shapes and appearances of truth and goodness. I fear nothing for this book from these critics, because it is written from decipherments of existing monuments, which are hidden mysteries to the masses owing to their having not yet learned to read the sign language written on the walls. Notwithstanding, the real gleaners of truth will know that I am correct in these translations. Massey states, they must find it difficult, those who have taken authority as truth rather than truth as the authority. Regarding Egyptian mythology, Massey states, there is nothing insane in it, nothing irrational in it. The insanity lies in mistaking it for human history or divine revelation. Mythology is the repository for man's most ancient science, and what concerns us chiefly is this: when truly interpreted once more, it is destined to be the death of the false theologies to which it has unwittingly given birth. The work of Freemasonry as a mystery school now emerges from the obscurity that has so long enshrouded it. Freemasonry is Isis, the mother of the mysteries, from whose dark womb the initiates are born into the mysteries of the second or philosophic birth. Thus, Freemasons, but virtue of their participation in the rites, are figuratively at least the sons of the widow, seeking to restore her lord. It follows that Masons are widows' sons. They are the offspring of the institution widowed by the loss of the word and of the eternal quest. In the Egyptian rites, Horus is the savior, avenger, the widow's son, conceived before the brutal murder of Osiris, hence he is the redeemer. And I wanted to mention left foot forward means human evolution. The great purposes of Freemasonry are thus revealed in unexpected clarity. Freemasonry is philosophically opposed to the reign of ambition. Its duty is to reestablish that golden age when wisdom, personified as Osiris, and not greed, personified as Typhon, shall dictate the course of human procedure. The day must ultimately come when the Horai, by virtue of their royal purpose, accomplish the consummation of the great work. The missing word will be found, the golden substitute will cast aside, and as promised in the ancient rite, Osiris will rise resplendent from the dead and rule the world through those sages and philosophers in whom wisdom becomes incarnate. And Osiris meaning the Egyptian science, not coercive government. In the meantime, the widow, the mystery school, continues to produce out of herself a host of potential redeemers, one of whom must someday become the true Horus, the avenger of all evil. And here's the essential authors that we're going to need to understand this presentation. And Churchward says, a man who clings to sensuals cannot associate with spirituals. If we want truth, we must labor for it quite as hard as we labor for gold. Egypt, how I have dwelt with you in dreams so long, so intimately, that it seems as if you had borne me. Though I could not know it was so many thousand years ago, and in my gropings darkly underground, the long lost memory at last is found of the motherhood, you, the mother of us all. And to my fellow man I must recall the memory too, that the common motherhood may help to make the common brotherhood. And that is the end of my presentation. So I want to say thank you to Brandon Martin for hosting the Seed 4 conference. I want to thank all of the speakers who are participating in it, and especially you, the viewer, who are trying to learn and understand this information. Thank you, and I hope that you found value in the information presented today.